Recorded. Okay. That's nice, Shauna. Always good to spend time with family when you can. Very nice. All right. So let me share my screen. And we are in Unit 4. And specifically, we need to go back and pick up the math. So we've talked about Unit 4, but now we just need to go back and pick up the math. So first off, if you guys can give me some thumbs up, so you see a screen that says math concepts, there are 43,560. Is that what you guys see? Awesome. Something somewhere is working right. So that's good. So when we are doing area math, Unit 4 math is basically area math. We're going to talk about measuring things like a house, how can we decide the land, the lot, that kind of thing. And there's a number. You need to know this number. I don't care. You got to put it on a flashcard. You need to know it. And y'all, this number isn't just to get you through your exam. This number is used often in the real world. So the number is 43,560, and this is the number that we need to know so we can convert square feet to acres and acres to square feet. Bottom line, every single acre has 43,560 square feet in it. If you want to multiply, or if you want to go from acres to square feet, you have to multiply. If you want to go from square feet to acres, you have to divide. Where are my T-bar fans? Guess what, guys? I have figured out a way to manipulate the T-bar just a bit to make this work. So you got two options. You can look at the formulas, or if we, again, it's a tweak. It is a tweak on the T-bar. Let's get that where we can see it. But if we tweak the T-bar just a bit, instead of on the bottom right using a rate or percent, this time with our adjustment, we're going to use the bottom right for our 43,560. The number that goes on top is square foot. And then the number that goes on bottom is our acres. It still works the same, where the back fourth line means divide. The up down line means multiply. It still works the same way. We're just not dealing with rate or percent. And again, whether you use the T-bar or the formulas, they're not going to give you that number. So no matter what you do, you need to know that 43,560. I've heard some pretty clever methods over the years to help us better memorize this number. My favorite one is 4 little old ladies driving 35 and a 60. We've all been behind them. We've all been there. 4 little old ladies driving 35 and a 60. If I have any NASCAR fans out there, I understand that Petty's number is 43. So if Petty goes 56 miles per hour, how many races is he going to win? He will win 0. 4 plus 3 is 7. 5 plus 6 is 11. 711 gives you 43,560. Put it on a flashcard, come up with a fun little thing for it. Doesn't matter. We just have got to know this number, and we got to be able to know how to convert it, like we said, from square feet to acres, acres to square feet. Questions so far, and does everybody have this jotted down? Because we're going to, now that we've seen it, we're going to play around with it a bit. Everybody good? Got it? All right. So let's play around with this number. Let's see what this means. And then, of course, we'll do we got several pieces of math to talk about. And then at the end, we'll do a couple practice problems together. And of course, I'll show you guys where you can find some practice on your own. So grab your not so smart calculators, set your chats to private, And tell me in a private chat how many acres are in 21,780. Again, you're either looking at the formula or you are looking at the T-bar, whichever. How many acres are in 21,780 square feet? And you can tell me in a private chat, please.
Okay, I'm here. Good morning, y'all.
Good morning.
Good morning.
About 30 more seconds and I want to talk about this before we touch it. But right now you're just telling me in a chat. All right, so let's see what we got here. Acres and 21,780. First off, when we do math, before you ever touch a calculator, sometimes you can look at the problem, you can look at the answer choices. Sometimes you can eliminate an answer choice before you ever touch a calculator. So as you start practicing, you can start formulating in your mind what type of answer you're looking for, what type of response you're looking for. What do I mean by that? For example, thumbs up or thumbs down? Is 21,780 more than or less than 43,560? 21,780 is less than. So if there are 43,560 square feet in an acre, and we only have 21,780, are we going to have more than 1 acre or less than 1 acre? We're going to have less than. So sometimes before, good morning, sometimes before we ever touch a calculator, and there's several other pieces of math that we can maybe look at these things ahead. I don't know what the answer is yet, but I know my answer has got to be less than an acre. Everybody with me? Never even touched a calculator, but I can tell you my answer is less than an acre. If you were doing the formula, then you said 21,780 times 43,560. If you were, no, I'm sorry, this is here. I'm sorry, it's divided by, apologize. It's divided by. So our square feet, I have 21,780. I'm solving for my acres. Question wants to know acres. And then we just have to know that magic number of 43,560. Back fourth line on the T-bar means divide. So X equals 21,780 divided by 43,560. It is, you guys told me, good job, you guys. That is half an acre. Don't get too excited on me. These area problems are ones that build off of each other. So the first step might be to convert it from square feet to acres, acres to square feet. We're going to see them build in just a minute, but we're just starting with the basics here and getting an understanding of how that works. Questions on this, how I got half an acre?
Yes. Where did you get 43,560?
There are 43,560 square feet in 1 acre. So you may, because we recorded, so you may want to come in and pick up what you didn't get to catch because you were a few minutes late. So just go back to that recording and you can pick that up.
Okay.
Okay. All right, that was fun. Let's do that again. Another question for you guys. Oh, and there's it worked out formula. Now I want to know in a private chat, how many square feet are in 4 acres? Again, using that magic number. just a few more seconds and we'll talk about it. Okay. So again, without ever touching your calculator, I have 4 acres. Do I have more than or less than 43,560 square feet? We're going to have more than. So whatever our answers be, it's going to be more than 43,560. So again, we'll see the formula in just a second. But if we're going to use the T-bar, we have to know that number. They will not give you that on your test. So we have to know 43,560 is taking the place of our rate or percent. Square feet goes on top. This is what I'm solving for this time. And then there are 4 acres. Back forth line, or excuse me, up down line on the T-bar means multiply. So if we take 4 times 43,560, we get 174,240 acres. So it's going to be one step in the process. They're going to give you square feet. You got to convert to acres. They'll give you acres. You got to convert to square feet. Maybe it's at the beginning. Maybe it's at the end. Maybe you got to toggle back and forth. But again, need to know this for your test. You need to know this for the real world as well. I do input data entry for my firm, and we work a lot with builders. And now we're dealing with raw tracts of land a lot of times. And the people want to know, okay, well, you tell me how many square feet that is, but how many acres is that? And I tell y'all what, knowing that number in the real world, you're going to be out one day showing property, and the buyer's going to see, why I see the lot dimensions, I see the square feet, but I wonder how many acres that is. And you're going to whip your phone out, you're going to tell them, and who's going to look like they've got the best agent? You with me? Because you know that information. So 43,560 questions on this. Of course, do what you got to do. Okay. Continuing with some area math, some other things that we need to know. We need to know how to measure some shapes. So maybe we're measuring a room, a kitchen, for example. Maybe we're not measuring a tract of lot, but we're provided with dimensions of a lot. So the shapes that we need to know how to measure, we need to know how to measure squares and rectangles. We also need to measure triangles, which we'll cover that in just a second. But the good news is we only need squares, rectangles, and triangles. So let's start with squares and rectangles. And to find square foot, you take length times width. Length times width equals square foot. This is typically the verbiage you see when you're measuring a kitchen, for example, or a living room, for example. You might see the dimensions of a lot or a land, and we're saying the same things. We're just using different verbiage. So when we're measuring a lot, they usually don't call it length. They usually call it front foot. Front foot is the part of the land that runs parallel to the road. The front foot is the length of the lot, and then the depth is the width. And again, we're still solving for square foot or area. All doing the same thing, just using different verbiage. So being familiar with the verbiage, the different ways they can introduce us to it. So let's say you have, this is your lot, and the road runs right in front of it. So you got your road. what we're saying now, the front foot is the part of the road that runs, that was a horrible line, parallel to the road. The front foot is that runs parallel to the road, also known as the length. So the length may be the front foot. The depth of the lot, then, if we were standing right here with our back to the road, the depth is how deep is it? How far back does it go? So if I wanted the square foot of this tract of land, we would take the front foot, the part that runs parallel with the road, and we would take the depth, what you're looking at when you have your back to the road. T-bar fans, we have this formula that can also be used as a T-bar. Again, making a little tweak, not really how the T-bar is designed, but we can make it work. So now the bottom two numbers are going to be your length and your width. The number on top is going to be your square foot. And I'll tell you guys, or your area. I'll tell you guys, where this comes handy, where this comes into play, is when they give you square feet and example length and ask you what the width is. So now we know we have to divide something. So the T-bar can help us in those cases. Otherwise, they may give you a lot dimension. You know, lot dimensions are expressed. The lot dimension may say that this lot is 150 feet by 160 feet. I'm making numbers up. But they may tell you that the lot is 150 feet by 160 feet. They just gave you the formula. They gave you the front foot, they gave you the depth. So how do you get the square foot? You just multiply length times width. We're gonna work some practice on this in just a second. We gotta talk about a triangle first. So I have questions on squares and rectangles though. Who remembers pre-algebra? This is A times B equals C. This is exactly what we're saying here. This is exactly what we're saying. A times B equals C. And they said you wouldn't use it in the real world. Look at us go. Questions, squares and rectangles. Sorry, I'm trying to remember to look over here. The other shape then that we need to know how to memorize, or need to know how to measure, I should say, is triangle. Triangle is length times width divided by 2. Why do we divide by 2? Can we all agree, for semantic purposes, that a triangle is half a square? You guys see that? I took the square, I chopped it in 2, I divided it by 2. And what am I looking at? I'm now looking at a triangle. So to find the square foot or the area of a triangle, we're going to take length times width and divide it by 2. And we will see in just a second when in the real world we may use a triangle. So we're going to get ready to start working some practice. As long as we have the formulas in front of us. Length times width divided by 2 for a triangle. Questions? All right, so what I want you guys to do, I got a picture here for you, and I want you to take just a few minutes. This is your tract of land. And in a private chat, I want you to tell me how many front feet are in this tract of land, how many square feet are in this tract of land, and how many acres. I'll give you guys a few minutes, and then we'll come back together and talk about it. about 30 more seconds and we'll talk about it. Okay. So the first thing this problem wants us to do is find front foot, and all front foot is the piece of the land that runs parallel to the road. So in this particular problem, how many feet run parallel to the road? 150 feet. There are 150 front feet. They front the road. They face the road. There are 150 front feet. Next, it wants us to solve for square feet. We're going to see both T-bar and formula. If you set this up by a T-bar, we have our length or our front feet times our width or our depth. Length is 150. Width or depth is 50. And what we are solving for is our square feet, which knowing the T-bar tells us that's the number on top in this case. Up, down line, here's your formula. Up, down line means multiply. So 150 times 50 gives me, should be 7,500 square feet. Length times width. Front foot times depth. Front foot times depth, length times width. Again, be prepared for the verbiage. We're all saying the same thing. It's just each problem may state it differently. Now that we know square feet, we can see how many acres. More than 1 acre or less than 1 acre? What do y'all think? A lot less, right? We got a little bit of square feet here. We are nowhere near an acre. So we can use, again, we can use our T-bar. This time I'm solving for acres, which we know the formula. We know that goes there. We know my square foot goes 7,500. And we know our magic number that we just have to know of 43,560. Running out of room. Up, down line, or back, forth line, I should say, on the T-bar. The formula of it is to take 7 square feet, divide it by 43,560, and we get 0.17 acres. A question comes in, do you round? So anytime, anything with rounding, they say if you go out at least 3 digits until you get to the end and then do your final rounding. So go out at least 3. So actually what I got on my calculator is 1.72, and then I can round that to 0.17. I want you guys to hear me. Please listen. You're not going to miss a problem by rounding alone. What do I mean by that? They're not going to give you answer choices so close that if you get 0.172 and I get 0.17, we're not going to know what the answer is. As long as you're not getting carried away with your rounding, at least give yourself some change. And as long as you're not getting carried away with your rounding, you'll be able to look at the answer choices and say, close enough, the error is rounding. Does that make sense? Everybody good with that? But at least give yourself change. They say go out 3. I say at least minimum 2, especially when we get into monies. So we had 150 front feet, 7,500 square feet, and then we have 0.17 acres. What questions do I have?
On the test, will they be using like the little apostrophe by the number to represent feet?
Yes.
Okay.
1 is feet, 2 is inches. Yep. Length times width divided by 2 is how we measure a triangle. We take the square, slash it, and now we can measure a triangle. And we're getting ready to see that next. So if we erase all of this, and then we can see the formulas worked out. So however you want to see that. This is a great place to, I usually get a lot of calls about, you guys have a question back in Unit 3, and I don't know why they put a measuring question in Unit 3, but they did. And when you're doing that for practice, this is where my phone starts ringing. And the question is telling you that there's a special assessment, and I think Jennifer is your homeowner, and you have to figure out how much Jennifer's piece of the special assessment is. So the special assessment is going to be based off of the front foot, how much Jennifer or whomever owes for the special assessment. Maybe there's potholes in the street and they got to come in and repair it. So however much Jennifer owes for that special assessment, figuring out how much she's going to pay, first off, depends on how many front feet she has, how much responsibility of the road she has. The question I get when you're looking at this calculation, again, it's in Unit 3, and when you're looking in this calculation, the very last thing they do, you get a number and then they divide it by 2. And the question I get is, why in the world do they divide it by 2? And the answer to that is because somebody owns the property across the street from Jennifer. So Jennifer's not responsible for the whole piece of street in front of her. She gets to share that responsibility with her across the street neighbor. So she only is responsible for half of the road that's in front of her. It's kind of a silly thing, really, but it's there. I doubt you're going to see that on your test, your state exam, but it's there. Again, just kind of gets us thinking a little bit. So that's back in Unit 3 when you come across that. Other questions so far? We've done square feet to acres. We've done square feet. We've done acres, front feet. Another formula, measuring formula, we need to know. Again, all formulas go on flashcards, you guys. We need to know how to solve for square yards. There are 9 square yards in a square foot. So to solve for square yards, you take length times width, our same formula. Length times width gives us square feet. And now that we have square feet, we can divide by 9 to get square yards. Square yards is used when you're measuring for flooring. So if you want new carpet or laminate or tile or something, the question is, well, how much flooring do I need? And when you go to the flooring store, they're going to use the measuring for square yards so they can determine how much carpet you need for that room or that area. So length times width gives us square feet. Square feet divided by 9 gives us square yards. Also with measuring, sometimes talking about properties, not so much the formula, but just understanding the verbiage, understanding what they're saying. So one way, especially builders, new construction, can determine out the cost of a brand new building. They may use verbiage such as cost per square foot or cost per acre. So when we see this word per, it's a fancy way of saying divide. So let's say, for example, you want to know the cost of the house. What does each square foot of this house cost? Every single square foot. And each square foot is calculated by labor, supplies, overhead costs, all that. So what we want to know is, to build this house, how much is it going to cost me per square foot, every single square foot? So let's say the home is valued at $250,000. Fancy word per tells us to divide. So the home is valued, the cost is 250,000, and there are 2,200, I'm just making numbers up, 2,200 square feet. The builder may want to know how much does each square foot cost. So we just take 250,000 divided by 2,200, and we find out, I'm going to round here and say each square foot cost me $114. You may be given, you may be told the cost per square foot is $114. If it's $114 and there's 2,200 square foot, the question may want to know what the cost is. So what's the opposite of divide? Let's see mouths move. Yeah.
Multiply.
Multiply. So if you take 114 times 2,200, you're going to find out, well, it's $114 per square foot. There's 2,200 square feet. How much is it going to cost me to build this house? $250,000. We can work it backwards. And it works the same way for acres, cost per acre. So let's say we have a very large tract of land of 50 acres. Each tract of land, if we were to separate each tract of land or each acre, we could sell each acre for, no, I did that backwards. Cost, let's say it's 50,000, 500,000, there we go. 500,000, there it is. And there are 50 acres. So the whole cost of this tract of land is 500,000. All in all, there are 50 acres in it. So the question is, if I wanted to subdivide and sell each acre on its own, what would each acre go for? What is the cost per acre? And now we would be selling it for 10,000. Again, if it tells you each acre costs 10,000 and there's 50 of them, you multiply 10,000 times 50 to get the total cost of 500,000. So again, it's a little bit understanding the math, but I think it's better understanding the verbiage, because this is builder speak. This is developer speak. This is land speak. Questions on this?
Hey, really quick, you said per means multiply, divide. Okay.
Our fancy word for multiply is of.
Right. I think it was a mixed understanding. Okay, thank you.
Of course. And I don't know if you know, but your camera's not on. I hear you, but it might have just popped off. There she is. I like seeing you guys. Okay. Good morning. Another piece of math we may be expected, or another shape, I should say, we may be asked to measure is something called a trapezoid. Well, first off, what the heck is a trapezoid? Trapezoid just combines two different shapes. So we're going to break this down in just a minute. When we do, we're going to see that I'm dealing with a rectangle and two triangles. Where in the world, in the real world, do we see a trapezoid? And the answer to that is more than likely in a bay window. So a bay window is a piece of the house that kind of juts out. So let's say, for example, this is your dining room or your kitchen with the breakfast room, for example. On the outside of the house, you may have this thing that kind of pops out, which is your bay window, which is your trapezoid. We're going to talk about measuring what does count as total heated square foot, how we can measure, what all that looks like. That's coming in Unit 8. So we're going to spend a little bit more time, which will be a good opportunity for us to revisit length times width equals square foot, that kind of thing. But the thing with the trapezoid, I think when you're measuring inside, when you're measuring a property, a really good rule of thumb is if it meets the criteria that we will talk about in Unit 8, and you can walk on it, then you can count it. So we know some trapezoids or some bay windows are a bench that you like sit on. If you have a bay window that you can actually walk out on, then we want to make sure we include that in our total heated square footage. So again, more on that when we get to Unit 8. We're going to talk about measuring properties and all that good stuff. For right now, though, we need to understand how a trapezoid would work. So we just took that bay window that we just had, and we're going to blow it up a little bit where we can see it. If you guys will turn with me in the back of your book, we're going to take a field trip to the back of your book, and let's go back to page 841. And we're going to look at this trapezoid on page 841 and talk about how we can measure it. So we have 10 feet. I have 14 feet. And then we have a depth from the top corner to the bottom corner, or the bottom ledge here, of 2 feet. That's supposed to be a dotted line. So what you're looking at here is a very rough version of what you're seeing on page 841. When we're doing a trapezoid, remember what we said when this started, you guys. The only shapes I know how to measure are squares, rectangles, and triangles. I'd like to tell you, in the real world, all houses are perfect squares, all rooms are perfect rectangles, but guess what? They're not the case. Look around your own house right now. Is it a perfect square? Is it a perfect rectangle? Or do you have places that aren't? So when we come across this in the real world and it's not a perfect square or perfect rectangle, we got to take the shape and chop it up and make it a shape that we can measure. Squares, rectangles, and triangles are all we need to worry about. So we got to chop it up and make it into squares, rectangles, and triangles. So my dotted line is my imaginary line, and I have it on both sides. And now that I've chopped it up, can you guys see I have a rectangle and we have 2 triangles. I have a triangle here and I have a triangle here. Can everybody see that? I took the trapezoid and I chopped it up into shapes that we can measure. I now have 1 rectangle and 2 triangles. Everybody good so far? Seeing the shapes? You'll use graph paper. You'll have tools to help. And again, we'll talk more about measuring and how that looks when we get to Unit 8. So let's start with our rectangle. My rectangle, the length or the width of the rectangle is 10 feet. The depth is 2, or the width is 2. So 10 times 2 for my rectangle gives me 20 square feet. And let me go back just a second, because this is my, whoops. This is my rectangle. So I took 10 by 2, the shape of my rectangle, and I got 20 square feet. Now we got to go back and get the triangles. If you will note, the top part is 10, the bottom base is 14. I just used up 10 of the 14 for my rectangle. So I've used up 4, which tells me 14 minus 4 tells me that I have 4 left. And when I take that 4 and cut it in 2, I get 2 for this triangle, and I get 2 for this triangle. So 2 plus 10 plus 2 gives me the bottom base of 14. I just account for it in the 2 different, 10 with the rectangle and 2 for each triangle. We know the triangle is length times width. Length times width divided by 2. So 2 times 2 is 4, divided by 2 is 2. We have 2 triangles. So when I add up my rectangle and both of my triangles, we get total square foot of this trapezoid of 24 square feet. We want to make sure we include that for this bay window because we can walk on it. We want to make sure we include that in our total heated square footage. You get scratch paper on both of your exams, my exam and your state exam. I encourage you guys to utilize the scratch paper. I like pictures. Pictures help me see it. So utilize your scratch paper for that and chop it up into shapes that you can measure. We can measure squares, rectangles, and triangles. Questions?
I missed a beat. How did you get that 24?
I added 20 for the rectangle and then 2 for each triangle.
Okay. Thank you.
You see that? Yep. So I got 20 square feet for the rectangle. I got 2 for each triangle. So we just added them up there.
Okay. Got you. Thank you.
Of course. Again, you guys, in the real world, not all homes are perfect squares and rectangles. Measuring can get very tricky. We don't necessarily have to measure ourselves. We can have hire somebody to measure for us. But again, that whole conversation is coming in Unit 8. So just bear with me. Fun with measuring. Questions on the trapezoid here? There is more math in Unit 4 than what you guys need to know. So you may even want to dog ear page 841 because it kind of talks more about our shapes. 840 and 841 talk about our square, our triangle, and our trapezoid. Those are the only shapes in the back of the book there that you need to work with. If we go back to Unit 4, our math concepts in Unit 4, I would actually go back through this recording and look at the math concepts and just highlight what we went over. Because if we didn't go over it, you don't need to know it for your test. There's more math in Unit 4 than what you need to know. So I would take the time and just pull out. And if we went over it, it's a candidate for the test. You may see some practice questions about something that we didn't cover. We talked about not needing to know how to find the acres in the rectangular government survey system. You may come across that on a practice question. Just skip it. Just don't worry about it. Questions? Can I erase? So I got a couple for you guys to work. Again, kind of taking what we've just done and building onto it a little bit. So let's put these in math, better real world examples. I want you guys to take a few times, just give it a shot. Make sure your chats are set to private and tell me in a private chat, A, B, C, or D. And then of course, we'll talk about it in just a minute. You got 30 more seconds and then we'll talk about it. Okay. So what's the very first thing we did when we saw this problem? See mouths move? Did you grab your calculator and start doing something without read? We've got to read first. We got to know what the question's asking. We have to know the information I have to know how it all plays out. So I have a lot with a depth of 80 feet, an area of 4,800 square feet. It was sold for $350 per front foot. How much did each front foot cost? In this case, each front foot cost $350. So now the question is, what is the total sales price? What is the cost? I'm a visual person. I like to see what it is that I'm doing. So whenever I see land and area, I'm going to take a second and draw it out. So here's my lot. I have a depth of 80 feet. I have a total square foot of 4,800. 4,800 feet. Do I know my width? Not yet. And to start, this is going to be one of these multi-step problems. So the first thing we need to do is define the length or the front feet. I can't find the cost if I don't know that front feet. So we have our depth, we have our square feet, and because I know I have to divide something, I find it much easier for this to use the T-bar. So I'm solving for my front foot or my depth. I have my length, yeah, and then I have 80 feet depth, and then I have square feet of 4,800. And what this does is help me identify what is being divided. That fourth line in the T-bar means divide. So we take 4,800 divided by 80, and I get a front foot or a depth or length, excuse me, front foot or length of 60. So I now know my front feet is 60. Questions so far, how I got the 60 front feet? Every single one of those front feet costs $350. Every single one of those front feet costs $350. Problem tells me that. So they each cost $350. I have 60 of them. So what's the cost, or what is the total cost per front foot? What we were looking for here was A, what is the total sales price? This lot will go for $21,000. I recommend pictures. I think it's a lot easier to see what it is, especially when we measure. Questions on this one? Is everybody good if I erase? Okay. Let's do another private chat. A, B, C, or D? 3 more seconds and we'll talk about it. What do we do first? Just read. Just read. Sit on your hands. Put your pencil down. Sit on your hands if you have to. How many acres are contained in a rectangular land parcel that has a length of 175 feet and a depth of 680 feet? I've read the problem. I know I'm going to do something with acres. So I know I can go ahead. When in doubt, just throw down a T-bar. Sometimes when we're doing math, I like to start with where I want to end. What do I mean by that? I want to identify my X because that's my goal. That's all I care about. So we go back and we ask ourselves, what is this problem asking me? What am I solving for? And what I'm solving for in this problem is acres. We know our T-bar. We know that acres is on the bottom left. I also know that magic number goes in the bottom right. Do I know my square feet? Not yet. So before I can complete this T-bar, I got to put it off to the side and go back and do a little bit more work to come back to it. And these are these multi-steps. Sometimes you got to do things to get to it. Sometimes you do the T-bar first and then do something else with it. They're all a little bit different, which again is why I highly recommend that we practice. So to find our square feet, we have, again, I'm a big fan of drawing it out so we can see it. I have my tract of land. I have a length of 175 feet. I have a depth or width of 685 feet. And I know to solve for my square feet, I take length times width, or 175 times 685. 175 times 685 gives me square feet of 119,875. And that is the piece I am missing. 19,000, yeah, 875. That is the piece that I'm missing in my T-bar. We did what we could and then saw what we needed. So if we know the formulas, if we know how to get to acre, then we can kind of piecemeal this together, however you see it. Now that I have my T-bar complete, back fourth line means divide. So I take 119,875, divide it by that magic number of 43,560, and I get 2.75 acres, or A. Multi-step problems. It all goes back to knowing how many square feet are in an acre, length times width, those formulas that we covered. Questions on this one? I guess my rhetorical question to you guys is always, do you see where you went wrong? And I know a few of you came in with D, and I'm thinking we saw the 119,875 and went, there it is. But we had that extra step to take. And that's the practice, you guys. That's how we learn. Sometimes you got to fall down before you learn how to walk. Questions? Okay. Can I erase? Good. Speak now. All right, so we got to finish up unit 4. We got to talk about where we can find all that practice, but before we do that, it is break time. So let's go ahead and take 10. Cynthia, where are you at? This one's for you. you like the fireworks? Do you like that one better? It's fun, isn't it? All right. Welcome back. So let's see. Figure out how to do screenshot for attendance. So let's try this. Make that work. So unit 4, again, just to kind of wrap this up. The key terms, remember we kind of started like we did the verbiage of it, talking about our different land descriptions. We did that last week. So we talked about things like meets and bounds. We talked about rectangular government survey system. We talked about the survey, the importance of the survey. So those key terms back on page 71. Your key point review, kind of your Cliff's Notes of unit 4 is on page 81. And then you have your student quiz on 82 to 84. Again, the math concepts are on page 80. You don't need to know all of it. Just focus on what we just covered. That math facts section in the back of your book kind of goes over some measurement. Again, just what we covered. And then last week, we introduced you to those 50 problems in the back of the book, starting on page 865. These are the numbers that relate to the math that we just did. So this is some really good area measurement math, that kind of thing. So you want to take just a minute and jot these numbers down so you know what to do for extra practice. Again, I consider those 50 problems in the back of the book, let's call those like 201. So once you've mastered the end of the unit, once you've mastered the online learning system, then you can, go back and tackle these at the back of the book. They tend to be a little bit trickier, but I've always heard if you can do these 50 problems in the back of the book, you're good with the math. So I suggest building yourself up to it. Guys, the good news is we don't do math again until like unit 8. So we got a couple weeks before we pick up a calculator again. So I recommend getting comfortable with unit 3 math, getting comfortable with unit 4 math, knowing that we have a little break on math before we get to unit 8. If we go real quick into the online learning system, the unit 4 material, there's some here in the interactive. There's also some of that math down here in unit 5. So if you're looking in the online learning system, some of these extra quizzes, and again, these, tell you why it's right or wrong, and then gives you the explanation. So we've been through 5, and you may have seen some of that math there. But practice, practice, practice. That's the key to math. I recently heard a great story. I want to share with you guys. I recently heard a great story. I mean, we know Michael Jordan, do we think Michael Jordan has always been amazing with a basketball? I recently heard a story the other day that indicated to me that he wasn't. I heard the first time he tried out for the high school basketball team, he didn't make the cut. He went home and said, Mama, I didn't make the team. And you know what Mama said? Well, son, I guess if you want to make it next year, you got to work harder. You got to practice more. And now look at him. So be the Michael Jordan of math, right? Get that mastered, practice, practice, practice. Questions, anything about unit 4? I need to stop sharing just for 1 second while you guys are asking. So you should be able to see each other again for the moment. Back and get you guys. So we got through unit 5 last week. Unit 5 is our, I don't know, I kind of call it the attorney's unit, because a lot of what unit 5 does is it goes over what is the closing attorney's responsibility. Please always remember, the buyer hires the closing attorney. Thus, the closing attorney represents the buyer. And everything the closing attorney does is to ensure that their buyer client has clear marketable title. So they're going to do that thorough search of the public records. If they find any clouds on the title or kinks in the chain, however you want to think of that, then they got to get with the seller to address those. Maybe it's the seller has to pay off a lien or two. Maybe there's something that requires the attorney and the seller to go stand in front of a judge and ask the judge to quiet the title, the legal process to settle whatever issue. So Unit 5 is all about titles and deeds, kind of what the closing attorney does. We're going to go through the entire contract to closing process. We're going to start talking about it in Unit 10 and really kind of do a deep dive in it when we get to 21. 21, I think, is my favorite because we go to closing in 21. We're finally getting there. We're building our way up to it. So then after 5, we started in Unit 6 last week, and we started with Unit 6 kind of talking about the importance of being the expert of your market, knowing the market, understanding the market, the neighborhood, the area that you want to work. And you guys remember, once you get licensed, your license allows you to brokerage any transaction as long as the property is located in the state of North Carolina. So part of being the experts of our market is first determining what market do we want. I'm not saying you can't tackle the entire state of North Carolina, but to be an expert of North Carolina is going to be challenging. So many of us start with counties or areas like Triad, Triangle, Charlotte, that kind of thing. But ultimately, it's up to you guys to decide where in North Carolina you want your market, where you want to practice. And then we started introducing you guys to public land use controls. We're going to get into private land use controls in just a second. Public land use controls, the important thing to know about the land use controls is how they're enforced. And with public land use controls, they're enforced by our local government. If you see a neighbor violating a public land use control, such as zoning, call the cops. Let them deal with it. That's what they're going to do. So we started talking about zoning and the different classes. And this is where we left each other the other day. And you can see zoning is kind of divvied the general classifications. You have residential, commercial, industrial, and agricultural. Most of these have sub classifications. So for example, it may not just be commercial, it may be office park or retail. Residential may be specific to single family or multifamily. So if an area is zoned for single family, how many families can live in that unit? How many families can live in that home? Single family means just one. Buyer's agents, you're helping a buyer buy. It's zoned single family zoning. There's a very nice apartment over the detached garage. And you hear your buyer say, well, gee, maybe I can rent that out to a college student. If it is single family, can they? Can we advise that? No, because single family only implies that one family lives there. Now, if that college student is related to you, then yes. But if they're not, helping our buyers understand what it is they're buying. And again, this unit, we get into kind of our role and our responsibility. The biggest thing that we do is we disclose. We disclose what we know. We disclose what we find. Guys, always remember, I'm a fact finder. I provide the information for them to make an informed decision. And we have a duty to make sure that our buyer's end use can be met. So let's say, for example, you're working with a buyer and they tell you that they want to be able to convert their garage into a hair salon. I now have a duty to make sure that zoning will allow residential and commercial. Everybody with me? Making sure that their end use can be met. And if this property is in a subdivision, then we may need to look at covenants. Will the HOA allow them to convert that garage into a hair salon? So helping our buyers make sure that their end use can be met. Again, being the expert of the market. I'm not saying you have to have zoning memorized. Please don't try to do that. But instead, we need to be able to know where to find that, how to get that information to provide it to our buyer. And that's what we mean by being the experts of our market. So again, this is where we left each other. on Thursday. For Unit 6, do I have any questions up to this point, up to what we've covered so far?
Only question I have is, what residential, is there like another like sub classification for like trailers and stuff, or is that all one
It
thing
could be a
together?
sub, it could be because some may allow, some may not allow. So yes, there could be a different sub classification for a trailer park, a mobile home park, something like that. Absolutely. Some areas of zoning may allow it, some may not. Because if you think about it, now we're dealing with multifamily, right? How many families do we have living on that tract of land? So it absolutely could be a sub classification in the multifamily. And Talia, to your point, I mean, if you want to buy a tract of land and have a bunch of people move their mobile homes on, we need to check that zoning to make sure that's allowed. That's part of that process. Yep. And the covenants if we're in an HOA. Thank you. So now where we are in Unit 6, we're on page 112. We have a bunch of zoning terms that we need to go over. There's just some vocabulary surrounding zoning that we need to be familiar. If you get a test question on these terms, what they're going to do is give you a scenario and say, which zoning term does this apply to? What's the zoning word? So we need a basic understanding of the term so we could A, B, C, or D and apply it to a situation. So the first zoning term that we have is a cluster zoning. And with cluster zonings, you can think of our cul-de-sacs. Cluster zoning is our cul-de-sacs. And the whole idea is to kind of reduce the lot sizes so you can increase the open space. You can see if the road just dead ended here, I probably wouldn't be able to get as many properties around the cul-de-sac. But by creating this cul-de-sac, by creating this cluster zoning, we can open that space a little bit and get more lots, get more properties. So cul-de-sacs are our example of cluster zoning. Another zoning term or word is our buffer zone. You may have a buffer zone to separate one type of zoning from the other. So for example, what we see most often is a buffer zone to separate residential from maybe commercial, maybe industrial. And as we're looking at our picture here, we can see there are residents in the top of the picture. There are homes and properties in the top of the picture. Over here is some kind of, I can't tell if that's a commercial or an industrial warehouse or something, but I do know it's not residential. And so to separate the two, to keep the two separate, we have this tree space right here, which is our buffer zone, which is protected, which means if you go out there with your chainsaw and take that down, when you get caught, you'll suffer those consequences. What are the consequences? Don't know, because each zoning board is local. Are they going to fine you? Are they going to throw you in jail? It's up to them. It's local in nature. But a buffer zone just kind of separates. You guys drive down the highway and you see those sound walls. On the other side of that sound wall is probably a residential neighborhood. That area is just meant to distinguish between Highway 85, Interstate 85. For example, in that residential area, that would be a buffer zone. Another zoning term is our extraterritorial jurisdictions, also known as our ETJs. ETJs are for municipalities or towns, boroughs maybe, that are right next to the city. They're not in the city limits, but they're right next to it. And they don't have the government power. They don't have enough people. They don't have the population to justify their own zoning. So what ETJs do is they piggyback off of the city. They piggyback off of the town. They're not in city limits, but they are subject to the city zoning. If that ETJ gets in city limits, they've been annexed. So if you annex that area in, they are now in city limits and the ETJ is going to go away. They have to pay those city taxes, all that. So ETJs right next door, not in city limits, and they just don't have the population or the manpower to have their own zoning board, to have their own zoning authority. Another zoning term is non-conforming use, and we got two different types of non-conforming use. So first off, non-conforming use is using the property in a way that is different from what the current zoning allows. Zoning can and does change. So a non-conforming use is using the property in a way different from what zoning allows. We have two different types of non-conforming use. The legal non-conforming use, and when I think of these, I like to draw myself a timeline so I can kind of see what it is I'm looking at. So if we have our legal non-conforming use, the use was in place. You were doing it, and then they went and changed the rule. They went and changed the zoning. So you were using it, and then they went and changed the rule. Let's say, for example, you had a gas station. It was zoned when you opened or you purchased that gas station, it was zoned to allow the gas station. So you were using that land as a gas station. Somewhere along the line, they rezoned it, they changed the rule, and now they're saying this area is only zoned for residential. No commercial, just residential. Here's the deal. You've been grandfathered in. You have a legal non-conforming use. They're not going to make you shut down the gas station. They're not going to make you change. They're going to allow you to keep continuing because you were there first. When you go to sell that gas station, it's very unlikely that the new owner will be allowed to continue using as a gas station because it is a non-conforming use. If you apply to the city for permits, maybe it's time to do some renovations and you apply for permits. We will talk about permits in just a second. So you apply for permits. You're probably going to get denied for a permit for renovation because it is a non-conforming use. So they're not going to make you shut down. They're going to allow you to operate until you're no longer operating. Legal non-conforming use. An illegal non-conforming use means the rule was there. Maybe you knew it, maybe you didn't, but you went and changed the use. The rule was in place. They said residential only, but you went and converted your garage into a hair salon. Now that you have that non-conforming use, that would be an illegal non-conforming use. You know, another example may be opening a home daycare. Before you open a home daycare, the first thing you need to do is check with the zoning board to make sure it's allowed. So non-conforming use, you're not conforming. One, you're grandfathered in. The other one, you just went and do it anyway, knowing you're breaking or not knowing you're breaking the rules. Questions on non-conforming use? Another zoning term is a variance. A variance is asking permission to break the rules. This is important. With a variance, it is always and only one property owner. One property owner is asking permission to break the rules. They're going to have to go to the zoning board and state their case, and they're going to have to prove some kind of hardship. Like, because of your zoning, my land is totally worthless. There's nothing I can do with it because of your zoning. Can you please break the rules just for me? If they are granted, then they have that variance, they have permission to break the rules. You do not know by looking at a piece of property if there's a variance or not. You don't know that because they don't advertise. That's not a public thing that they advertise the permission. If you suspect somebody's not using the land right, you contact the local authority looks into it, and guess what they discover? They discover that variance. They discover that that permission has been granted. Again, the key to this, how many property owners? Everybody show me. How many property owners? Just one, only one. So let's look at an example of a variance. Henry is a real estate developer. He purchases a large warehouse to convert to a 12-unit apartment building, a use that is allowed by zoning. However, there's an on-site parking requirement of 2 parking spaces. Since the warehouse takes up much of the land, Henry can only create 12 parking spaces and thus would not be able to comply with the on-site parking requirement. Henry can go to the zoning board and request a variance. Is he going to get it? Maybe. It depends on the zoning board, might depend on their mood that day, right? It just all depends. We're not the local zoning board, so I can't tell you if Henry's going to get it. What I can tell you in this case, Henry should go to the local zoning board, prove his hardship, prove that he can't use this property the way that the local requirements are, and request permission to break the rules. Another zoning term is a special use permit, also known as a conditional use. Several of these things have several different terms or words. So this is permission to use the property in a special way. Again, the key here is it's going to be in the public interest. So for example, you might have a church in a residential neighborhood. You might have a hospital. A special use. We're asking permission to use the property in a special way, maybe a library or a school. It's something that could benefit the public, the residences of that area. So again, we just got to get permission from the zoning board, special use permit.
The only question I have is, as a realtor, is it in our lane to let them know about the variance?
If we find it. And it may not continue to the next owner, like the next owner may have to prove that, right? But yeah, if we come across it, we're going to have to let them know. Yep. Disclose what you know. When in doubt, disclose. So let's look at an example of our special use permit. Little Ones purchases a lot in a residentially zoned area with plans to build and operate a new daycare center to serve 50 children. Zoning ordinance permits a daycare center, but only as a special use. Little Ones would first need to apply for a special use permit. If the special use requirements are satisfied, they should be able to get the approval to operate this daycare within the residential area. It's in the best interest of this neighborhood, of this area, to have a daycare. It serves the public. Another zoning term is a zoning amendment. Please write something down for me. An amendment is a change. An amendment is a change. So a zoning amendment then is a request to change the current zonings, the current zoning. This happens on the regular. Maybe the local authorities want to change the zoning to allow new businesses to come in. Maybe the residents want to change the zoning. You guys, when you're out driving around, I want you to start looking for zoning signs. And when you start looking for them, you're going to see them everywhere. Typically, zoning signs are white signs with red Z's or red signs with white Z's. And what those zoning signs are letting you know is that there's a public hearing coming up to discuss a proposed zoning amendment. If you live in that area, if you work in that area, if that's the market you choose to take, then you may want to consider attending that meeting, voicing your opinion. But before they change the zoning, they're going to hear from the people, they're going to hear from the public, get the residents' feedback on it before they make a decision whether or not to change that zoning. Do I have any High Point people on the call? Maybe a few of you. If you go up like Skeet Club, up Johnson Street and Skeet Club, right there on the corner, if you're familiar with it, they wanted to put a Publix on the corner. And that thing didn't make it past the zoning board yet. It's been turned down once. I don't think it's over. I think if Publix wants to come, they're going to come. But for right now, it didn't pass the first round of the zoning board. And I heard it's because it was such an uproar at the meeting that the zoning board said, maybe we need to rethink this. Maybe we need to reconsider this. So they don't always get passed. They do hear from the public. They want to hear from you guys. Again, if you see one of those zoning signs, pull over safely and maybe take a picture of the information, because that's telling you the case number. That'll lead you to, when you look it up online, that'll tell you the date of the meeting, that kind of thing. We're going to see this word amendment again when we talk about our contracts. And we're going to talk about how we can amend or change our contracts. So an amendment is just a change. Specifically, a zoning amendment is to change the zoning. Another term, zoning term, is our overlay district. This is like stacking, like one layer of zoning on top of the other. Where we typically see this might be, for example, a residential zoning stacked with historic district. If you live in a historic district, you got to follow both zonings, the residential and the historic. When I think of the overlay district, you guys remember this thing, this contraction down here at the bottom right? And you took these transparencies and you wrote on the transparencies and then you put it on the glass, and then it projected, this light came out that was brighter than the sun, and this light came out and projected the image on the wall of the screen. You guys remember these things in school? And then you would get that kooky teacher that put two transparencies on top of each other. They were overlapping. They were showing us that overlapping district. They're superimposed, one's laid on top of the other. Another zoning term is our historic preservation zoning. So those properties that are in a historic district. I don't know of many cities or towns that don't have a historic district. So if you live within that historic district, you will also have historic zoning. What historic zoning concentrates on is the exterior. The idea of historic preservation is to keep the outside looking like it did back in the day. My Winston-Salem people are familiar with Old Salem. Old Salem needs to look like Old Salem on the outside. So if you wanted to paint your, do y'all know people live in Old Salem? Those are like real houses that people live in. And if you wanted to paint your house pink, I promise you it wouldn't pass, because back in the days of Old Salem, we didn't have pink exterior paint. We didn't have, some of these fancy things. So we got to keep the exterior looking like it did. If you ever get the chance, once you get licensed, if you ever get the chance to show a property in Old Salem, go. Because I'm telling you, once you walk in the front door, it's like literally walking through time. The outside looks like Old Salem, but you walk inside, it's very modern, very up to date, looks very, very nice in some cases. All they carry about is the exterior, keeping it look like Old Salem. If you want to make a change, you have to go through the board. You have to ultimately obtain a certificate of appropriateness. The certificate of appropriateness may say something along the lines of no exterior portion of historic properties can be erected, altered, restored, moved, or demolished until that certificate of appropriateness has been submitted to and approved by the Historic District Commission. So if you want to change your siding or your yard work, things like that, it's got to get approved. You got to get this certificate from your local History District Commission. Another zoning term is aesthetic zoning. This is all about appearances. This is just trying to keep things pretty, keep things looking nice. Some cities, for example, may say all commercial buildings downtown have to be brick, for example. So if you want to build a commercial building downtown, you know your exterior has to be brick. Some have limits on how high the sign can be, your signage. We don't want to take away from that big, beautiful sky. So we're going to put a 5 feet limit, for example, on the signs. Blue Ridge Parkway. There's people that live along the Blue Ridge Parkway. They very well may have aesthetic zoning to keep it looking pretty. Another zoning term is spot zoning. Here we have one or more properties rezoned to allow for a use than the neighbors. I think the best example of a spot zoning could be like a playground within the residential area. Maybe we take a couple of those vacant lots at the end of the street, turn it into a playground. Spot zoning is illegal if it benefits the property owners. Spot zoning is okay if it's in the public's interest. So it's just rezoned to allow a different use from what the neighbors. I understand spot zoning and conditional use or special use permit is very similar. But rest assured, you guys, remember your test question is going to give you a scenario. Those that are similar, they're going to have to give you a lot more information for you to distinguish between the two. So again, here's a scenario. Which zoning term do you think applies, A, B, C, or D? Please just have a basic understanding of our zoning words. Questions?
I actually have a question.
Yeah.
So I see like these little footnotes in the paragraph with spot zoning. Does that mean different meanings or?
What do you mean, like footnotes in the book?
Yeah, it's like 1, 2, 3, 4, and it looked like different meanings. Or is that something
What
different?
page are you on?
115.
Oh, that's just talking about what all it can include. So that's just a better explanation of the spot zoning.
Oh, okay.
So that's information you'll want to look at, get that better understanding. But yeah, that's all about spot zoning there. So when we introduced you to this unit last week, I said that Unit 6 is really the first unit that starts bringing in the role of the broker. So when it comes to zoning, what do we need to know in practice? What is our responsibility as a real estate agent, as a real estate broker when it comes to zoning? And the first thing we have to say is we have this duty to disclose. I'm going to help my buyer, especially if they share an end use with me. I don't know. Life gets complicated, you guys. I like to keep things simple, and I tend to operate on a couple super simple philosophies. Another one of my super simple philosophies. You ready to jot this down? If it's important to my buyer, then it's important to me. If it's important to my seller, then it's important to me. If it's important to my landlord, to my tenant, if it is important to my client, then it is important to me. So when my buyer looks at me and says, I have this specific end use, this is what I want when I buy this property. Guess what? I now have something that's important to me, helping them meet that specific end use. And with use, zoning comes into play. We have a duty to help them discover and disclose. Remember, if you don't have this written down yet, please write it down. I am a fact finder. I'm not the one buying this house. I'm not the one taking on the 30-year mortgage payment. I'm the one helping you decide. So I'm going to disclose what I know, disclose my zoning. Also, as brokers with different roles. If you're the one working with the seller, we must check zoning before we list a property. Now we're going to start talking about your multiple listing services, which is the platform that we put our listings in, and the IDX feed takes it out to thousands of websites. It all starts in the multiple listing services, or the MLS. And most MLS's zoning is a required field, which means I can't enter my listing without looking up zoning. And guess what? It needs to be accurate. We should be able to rely on it. So listing agents, you're always checking zoning. You have to before you put your listing in. Buyer's agents, we should be able to rely on the information in MLS. We should be able to rely on what the listing agent says. However, if I have a little red flag goes up, or if I have a buyer with a specific end use, then I have a duty to help them verify. I have a duty to make sure that their end use can be met. So with zoning, my responsibility as a broker is to help them discover, and I have a duty to disclose whatever I find. Questions? Urban versus rural, how it's zoned. I mean, we got commercial on the left, agriculture on the right. So whether or not it's in town, urban is just referring to it's in town. Rural is saying outside of town. So if you go into urban areas, you may have different responsibility, different zonings than if you're going out rural. Again, it all comes back down to being the experts of our industry, the experts of our market, and knowing where we can find this information. I don't want you guys worrying about that right now, though. Once you get your license and you affiliate with your firm, they will assist you. They will help you know where you can get started. So if we look at an example, an owner hired a broker to list a vacant building previously used as a computer repair shop. Prospective buyer asked the broker if a manufacturing company could operate in the building without investigating. Can we see where we went wrong? Without investigating, the broker said, yes. Buyer made an offer, seller accepted, and we are under contract. Prior to closing, the buyer discovered the zoning was commercial, a zoning class that excluded manufacturing use. What could happen in this case? The buyer could go after their agent because they came into this with false information. They could try to rescind their contract through a court. They could try to take their contract back because of the misrepresentation. They could file disciplinary action. They could hire an attorney. What could they do? Whatever action they deem necessary. What's going to happen to you? I don't know. I'm not the real estate commission. I'm not the judge. I can't answer that. But what I do know, to give you guys an advantage, you need to document what? Document everything. You don't know where the lawsuit's coming from. You don't know where the disciplinary action's coming from. But in the event that it does, you need your documentation. In this case, I believe the agent's going down because they didn't look at it. They didn't look it up. And one thing the judge is going to want to know is, could you have found this information out? Well, I didn't look it up. I just thought yes. They're at fault, you guys. Do not answer a question unless you know. I don't know, let me get back to you is a perfectly acceptable answer. Does that make sense to everybody? Don't say things for the sake of saying it. You guys think about the money that goes into purchasing a property. And once that deed changes hands, it's not like there's a 30-day return policy or something. Once they're stuck with this property, they're stuck. So that duty to discover and disclose, again, being the expert of our market and knowing where we can find that information so we can provide the facts for them to make an informed decision. Questions? Let's take 10. We come back, we're going to talk about subdivisions. We're going to talk about some other public land use controls. And then we get into private land use controls. So we'll keep going in unit 6. that one I have to end. It would keep going if I let it. But we are back. A couple of you have reported internet issues. I'm relating it to the weather. Do what you got to do. It's like some of you are on your phone. That's fine if you need to come on your phone. If you lose power for today, I'm good with that. Just remember, if you're in a car, it's not moving. All right. So I'm going to take attendance. Welcome back. And that. And still on public land use controls, but we're going to kind of break away from zoning. And another thing that public land use controls can offer us is the creation of subdivisions. Now, this is not specifically about the covenants. We're going to talk about the covenants in just a bit. Not all subdivisions have covenants. Not all subdivisions enter in an HOA. What we are talking about right now is the creation of a subdivision. And whether or not this subdivision will get approved is going to come down. It's a public land use control to allow this subdivision. So first off, a subdivision, the definition, it's in your book on page 116. The definition of a subdivision is a division of a tract of parcel of land into 2 or more lots for the purpose of building, development, and includes all division of land, including the dedication or the creation of new streets. So when it comes to getting permission to build, the developer has to approach the zoning board, say, I want to build this subdivision that's going to have however many houses. This is what I want for the streets. That's the kind of thing. Step 1 for the developer is to get it approved through the zoning board. And that's why that's a public land use control. The zoning board, if this subdivision doesn't fit into that master plan, remember each city, town, county, municipality has its master plan. Where do we see ourselves in 20 years? And if this subdivision doesn't fit that definition, then it probably won't get approved. So again, the developer is starting with the zoning board first to see if we can get approvals for the subdivision. Real quick, I'm not spending a lot of time here, but just real quick to that subdivision definitions, there are a couple exemptions. In other words, if you have division of land where each parcel is 10 or more acres with no street right away, or if you have a division of land no more than 2 acres and no more than 3 with no street right away, then it doesn't fall under the definition of a subdivision. So we're just referring to subdivisions here. So the land development, again, the permission to build, the permission to create the subdivision has to run through the local zoning board. Perfect, thank you, Lynn. Has to run through the local zoning board. And whether or not we get approval is going to be if the zoning board determines that it complies with the overall master plan. Subdivisions come with a plat map. We talked about these a little bit back in Unit 4. You can see another example of a plat map here on your screen. Here's the deal with plat maps. We can put a buyer under contract with a preliminary. You know, the first buyer to buy in the subdivision is really the guinea pig, if you will. We can put a buyer under contract with a preliminary plat map. We cannot close on the first unit until the final plat map is approved and recorded down in the public records. This takes us back to a buyer deserves to know what they're buying. And that's why we cannot expect a buyer to close without having the final plat map. Again, we can put them under contract. If we're under contract with a preliminary plat map and the plat map changes, the buyer should be given the option. We've made these changes. Do you want to proceed with, or do you want to back out of the contract without any consequences? So the first couple buyers or two in the subdivision are really the ones that are setting the path, setting the way for all the others. So the plat map, And it's down in public records. So anytime you're helping a buyer buy in a subdivision, we know we can go in public records and check out that plat map. If the developer just starts building without getting that permission, that is illegal. They will suffer fines, possibly jail time. Again, I don't know the answer to that. It's going to be dependent on the local zoning board. And here's the deal with subdivisions, you guys. There's a whole lot of work that goes into it before you and I ever see the big equipment show up to clear the land, subdivide it, and start building on it. There's a whole bunch that goes into it. And part of it is making sure the developer gets approval from the zoning board that they have the permission to proceed. Do they have the funding? Do they have the resources? You know, it's putting it all together. By the time you and I see the equipment, by the time you and I start to see a subdivision being built, they are well into the process. The process is on page 117, just kind of an FYI. I think it's important that we understand that approval process. But that preliminary, that initial planning, finding the land, making sure we get approval to build, making sure it's buildable for what the developer wants. We got to get zoning board approval, financing, etc. Our final planning stage then is finalizing everything. And then it's not until stage 3 that you and I start seeing these things build up. If you've had a subdivision built near you, man, once those things get started, they go fast, don't they? But there's a whole lot that goes into it before we ever start to see it. Probably one of the more important things to decide and make sure that the builder and the zoning board are all on the same page with early on are the streets. You have in your book 118 to 120, you can see the italicized there are the specific street disclosure laws. I wouldn't sit down and study these, but it may not be a bad thing to look them through, look them over. So when a developer decides to build, the first thing they have to do is determine if the streets will be private or public. Now, I'm not talking about whether or not you can drive on it or not. We're talking about who maintains it. Public streets are going to be maintained by the North Carolina Department of Transportation or the DOT. Private streets are maintained by the homeowners that live on that street. There's usually going to be an HOA or special assessments for, snow removal. What do we do if we get a pothole? Things like that. So private versus public. So the developer dedicates at the beginning of the creation of the subdivision, the developer dedicates the street as private or public. And if they dedicate it public, DOT is going to tell them how they want their streets built. DOT says, if you want us to maintain it, you're going to build it our way. And if they don't build it their way, if they don't do it per DOT's instructions, then they're not going to accept the responsibility. So just because it may be dedicated for public doesn't mean we have acceptance or final approval until the developer is done and all that heavy equipment is out of there. Some subdivisions, you may just have one phase and we'll get acceptance once the last house is built. Other subdivisions, you may have different phases, different sections, depending on the size, depending on the developer. This is what you and I need to know about this. This is what's important. Until the last house is built, we don't know for sure if DOT is going to accept the responsibility. And let me tell you something, DOT comes by on the regular and checks to make sure that their streets are being built the way that they expect. So we get in, we clear the land, we pave out a street. The developer paves out a street or 2 or 5, however many there is. They're going to go ahead and put the first layer of concrete down. And that allows their big, heavy equipment to get in and out so they can start building houses. If you've ever driven through a subdivision that's being built, you will notice that the curb has a space. Maybe the manhole covers look raised. They're kind of poking out of the middle of the ground. We're only operating on that first layer of concrete right now. Once all of that heavy equipment is out, we have finished the last house, then they come in and put down the final layer of concrete. Then they put down that final layer. And that's when DOT decides if they will accept responsibility for those public streets. If you are working with a buyer that is buying in a new subdivision that's not complete, you see that there's still space on the curb, you see that there's still room for another layer of concrete, we need to let our buyer know. The developer proposed to have this as a public street, and as long as they keep doing what DOT requires, but we need to let them know that there is no guarantee. We'd like to think, but we're not DOT, and I can't tell you what they're going to say. Never look at a buyer and say, oh, I'm sure DOT will accept it. Don't worry about it. Because if the developer doesn't build the street the way DOT expects, they're not going to accept responsibility, which means that street will be private. And as we said, who maintains a private street? The homeowners. So we kind of need to give them that caveat. Don't give them guarantees. Y'all, this is one of these things in real estate that got really big really fast. There were a lot of new subdivisions built in the 90s and even early 2000s. The buyers were told that the streets are public. But guess what? DOT never accepted the responsibility. And so now these streets are not being maintained, and we got potholes and nobody comes and removes the snow. It's a mess. And the homeowners on that street are like furious. They're going to the HOA and they're going, why aren't you fixing this? Or why isn't DOT fixing this? And the HOA is saying, oh yeah, because they're private. There's a lot of cases out there right now like this. And so because of that, the Real Estate Commission has cracked down, and we need to be very careful what we say. Don't guarantee anything to anybody unless you know for sure. If they're still building, it's dedicated as public, but it won't be accepted until that last piece of equipment is out. Let's see, I see a question. Talia, yes, ma'am. You might be on mute. Yeah.
Okay, there we go.
Yeah.
What does DOT stand for?
Department of Transportation.
Okay, thank you.
So understand dedicated versus accepted. Remember the Q&A brochure we looked at for condos and townhomes in Unit 2? I have one of those Q&A brochures from the North Carolina Real Estate Commission in our Unit 6 material in the online learning system. It's about subdivisions and it's about streets. So I do recommend that Q&A brochure as a additional tool, an additional piece of information to better understand streets in North Carolina. Other questions? When it comes to streets, let's bring this home. What's it mean for us? Regardless of the age of the subdivision, we're not just talking about new subdivisions, because as I just said, we have older subdivisions that were misrepresented 20, 30 years ago, and now it's an issue. So regardless of the age, when your buyer is buying in a subdivision, we have a duty to verify the streets. Some lenders want to see this as well. Some lenders require this. It might be on the type of loan, for example, the loan product. Is it private versus public? And that's all information you can find online through the developer, etc. But we have a duty to find out. Again, I'm not telling you not to buy. I'm just providing you the facts. I'm providing you the facts so you can make that decision whether or not it's public or private. Also, with subdivisions, we have an act, and this is called the Interstate Land Sales Full Disclosure Act. And this act applies to sales of lands of subdivisions, plots of subdivisions across state lines. So let's back up in time for a minute. How many of you, I know I'm not the only one, how many of you on this call remember life before the internet? Yeah, right? Not all hands went up. I'm just saying. It's not all of us remember that, right? But there, what kind of sort of, you heard about it, right? There was a period of time, you guys, when we didn't have the internet. And this is when the Interstate Land Sales Full Disclosure Act happened. Buyers didn't have the resources that they do today, right? They were relying on the salesmen. And what was happening was salesmen were crossing state lines, going to areas where buyers weren't familiar with the land, weren't familiar with the subdivision, and trying to sell them, that shady salesman thing, and trying to sell them a tract of land sight unseen. And not all their information may have been factual. So this was created back in the day to help protect that consumer across state lines. But guess what? This is still going to apply today, because isn't all of your marketing now across state lines? I mean, shoot, our marketing now is worldwide. So we are crossing state lines with our marketing. It still applies today. And what it says is the information that must be given has to be accurate. We have to provide them with that information before we expect them to buy sight unseen, for example. Questions on subdivisions? Another thing we deal with publicly are building codes. Building codes are statewide. Remember, zoning is local in nature, building codes is statewide. So we have North Carolina standard building codes. Building codes are there for developers. They provide the minimum construction standards with safety being the primary focus. So developers, when they build a house, when they go to build a house, they have to follow these state building codes. They could go above and beyond the codes, but the codes provide the minimum. When somebody's building a house or doing major renovations, we're going to talk about permits in a second. And the permitting office comes out periodically throughout the construction process. So like before the sheetrock guy shows up, we got to get the plumbing and electrical behind this wall inspected. Now that it's inspected, make sure it's up to code. Now we can have the sheetrock guy come up, put up this wall, that kind of thing. It's done in stages of construction. So as mentioned with building codes, we could deal with permits. Permits are permission to build. Permits are permission. So maybe you're building, maybe you're doing major renovations. If approved by the local authority, you will be issued a permit, which is permission to do the work that you applied for. Once that work has been complete and it's completed satisfactorily, then they provide the CO, also known as a certificate of occupancy. Don't let the name fool you here. The CO just says this property was built according to current building codes. COs close out a permit. So a CO verifies that it was done properly. I've always heard that anytime you're doing renovations, if you're messing with the big stuff, electrical, plumbing, or structural, you need a permit. Now, about this time of the class, I get a permit. Do I need questions? Do I need permit to do this? Do I need permit to do that? I don't know. What I do know is NC General Statute 160D-1110C will answer those questions for you. So if you have questions about what does a permit need, what not, jot this down, look it up after class. You're not going to be tested on this, on the North Carolina General Statute. It's just here for reference for you, because I'm not the permitting office, so I can't answer whether or not you need a permit. Makes sense? I'm staying in my lane, and I'm referring you to the source. Not everybody knows that they need to have a permit, or some people know and they don't care and they just go and do it anyway. Throughout your career, you're going to come across unpermitted space. You're going to come across space that was finished without a permit. The seller will look at you and say, well, I didn't know that. Maybe they did, maybe they didn't. So let's say, for example, you're going on a listing appointment and you notice that the basement has recently been finished. It looks nice and neat and clean. You can still smell the paint, right? It's fresh. Maybe you notice the room at the back of the house has recently been added. One, you can just kind of tell it just doesn't quite fit the rest of the home. But two, when you look in the tax records, it's not there. If it were permitted, it would be on the tax record. So anyway, for whatever reason, you find unpermitted space. And when we do come across that unpermitted space, I have a duty to disclose that that space is unpermitted. This is your very first introduction to material fact. We're going to dance around material facts, but we're going to hit them hard when we get to unit 7. So just bear with me. We're going to talk about material facts. For right now, what we need to know is we have a duty to disclose material facts. So when and if you come across this unpermitted space, we have to disclose it. Guys, sometimes we just have to ask questions. So we do our research, we look at those tax records, and then we see things and we ask questions. Oh, wow, this room looks really nice. Did you guys add this on? We have to be able to ask the hard questions so I can properly represent my client, but I can also properly market the material, market the property. I had an acquaintance, and I knew her when she bought her house. It was a 3-bed, 1-bath. I mean, I was at her housewarming party. Like, I saw it, you know, I knew it. Fast forward some years, and she called me and said, hey, I want to sell. Do you want to talk to me about listing it? I said, sure. So I went, did my research. We're starting to talk about what that research is. One research you can do is pull up the tax records. And I pulled up the tax records and it said it was a 3-bed, 1-bath house. So I went to my acquaintance's home to talk about listing it. And she was giving me the grand tour. And guess what I stumbled across? A second bathroom. What did the tax records say? 1. What did I see when she bought it? 1. Did my flag just go up to prompt me to ask some questions? And let me tell y'all something. She was proud. She was like, oh yeah, we took part of the pantry and part of the closet. We made our own bathroom and we did this. And she was very proud. And I said, did you guys pull permits? She went, no, we didn't pull permits. All right. I could advertise it as a 3-bed, 2-bath, but I had to disclose that that second bath was unpermitted space. We have to disclose when we find that out. Because you know what a good buyer's agent's going to do? They're going to look in the tax records and they're going to see 3-bed, 1-bath. They're going to see this information. A good buyer's agent is going to see this information as well. Again, we're starting to get into our roles and responsibilities. So keep it simple. Let's build on it. And right now, know that when we come across, when we discover unpermitted space, it's a material fact that we have to disclose what we know. Yes, ma'am.
Never mind.
So nice side-by-side comparison. Building codes are construction standards for safety. Building codes are statewide. Zoning is local, and it regulates how we use the land. Residential, commercial, maybe there's a setback. Maybe it says you can have a commercial building, but it can't be more than 4 stories tall. Zoning can get very specific. It can be very broad. It varies. By the way, I didn't get that listing. I know she was talking to other agents as well, which I appreciate her letting me know that. For whatever reason, when I don't get a listing, I hate it when I don't get a listing for whatever reason. And I will stalk a listing because I want to know who got it and how much did they list it for. And I stalked her listing for a while and it never did list. She ended up going for sale by owner. And I have to wonder if it didn't have something to do with that second bathroom that just magically appeared. You may be able to apply for a permit after the fact. But again, once this wall is up, the only way to know that the electrical behind this wall is good is to take it down. So it's going to be work involved. It's going to be money. I made that available to her and she said, nope, I'm not doing that. So, okay, I can't make anybody do anything. All I can do is recommend. She ended up selling it on her own. I guess that's how you avoid the the permitting thing. Questions on our building codes? Another thing dealing with public land use controls. Talking about on-site septic systems. It's got to go somewhere, you guys. If the property is not connected to public sewer, then they're more than likely on an on-site septic system. On-site septic system are just tanks that are buried underground, and they're meant to take on the capacity of the water leaving the property. Where the septic system can go on the property, the size of the septic system, even if the land will support an on-site septic system, all comes from your county health department. So whatever county the property is in will regulate the on-site septic system. A perk test will help us determine that the land will support that on-site septic system. This is especially important. The perk test comes up if you're buying raw land and you want to build and maybe it's not available to hook up to public water, public sewer. So the on-site septic system gives us some information. Again, it tells us where you want the property above the septic system. You don't want the water to run down into the property, right? So you want kind of where it's located with the property. That's important. How far away from the property. Again, the capacity, the limit, the size of the tank. The on-site septic system, the permit is going to tell us the location, where the septic system needs to go in relation to the property. It's also going to disclose if there's any uses that could overload the system. For example, garbage disposals are awfully hard on your on-site septic system. So there may be certain uses that could overload the system or are not recommended unless you want it to back up into your home, into your property, which we probably don't. The permit will also tell us the capacity. And the capacity of the on-site septic system is stated as a number of bedrooms, the number of bedrooms allowed, the number of bedrooms that this capacity, this septic system will support. The rule of thumb is 2 human heartbeats per bedroom. So if your on-site septic system permit has a capacity of 3 bedrooms, that means the system will support 6 people, 2 human heartbeats per bedroom. When we talk about the on-site septic system, it's in bedrooms and not in bathrooms because it's referring to all of the water that leaves the house, not just bathroom water, shower water, kitchen water, dishwasher water, washing machine water, right? All the water that leaves the house. They have an algorithm that figures out about how much water we use. And the size of the tank or the capacity is stated in the number of bedrooms. Listing agents. Before you list a property, we've got to get our hands on the permits so we know how many bedrooms to list the property for. You may have a 4-bedroom home, but if the capacity, if the permit says 3, I can only list it for 3. We've got to list it the number of bedrooms as allowed per the permit. So this is where you might see a 3-bedroom with an office or a 3-bedroom with a bonus room, for example. There's been numerous of times that I've been shown property, 3-bedroom property. And my buyers and I have been standing in what could perfectly well be a really good 4th bedroom. And the question is, why didn't they call this a bedroom? And the answer generally is because the permit only allows for 3. This is another one of these things that got really big really fast because we weren't always paying attention to these permits. I had a teammate that went on a listing appointment, I don't know, a couple years ago now. When these people bought it, they bought it as a 4-bedroom. But then they cracked down and they got serious about it. My teammate found the permit, looked at the permit said 3. So they bought it as a 4, and now we're telling them they can only sell it as a 3. Are they upset? You better believe it. And again, this is one of these things that's gotten really big really fast. So just make sure you get your hand on that permit. Maybe the seller has it. If they don't have the permit, then we can get the county health department on the phone and get one ordered. We've got to know how many bedrooms to properly advertise. So when it comes to the on-site septic system, again, our role, we have a duty to verify the number of bedrooms that are allowed per the permit, the septic permit. If you're helping a buyer buy unimproved land, raw land, just dirt, and they can't or they're not hooked up to public sewer, then we want to encourage them to have a perk test done to make sure the land will support it. Any misrepresentations, you're going to be subject to disciplinary action. You can be sued. The court can fine you. The real estate commission cannot. The real estate commission can just regulate your license. What is this buyer going to do when you sell them a 4-bedroom and come to find out it's only 3? They're probably going to call their attorney first. Do you guys have your documentation? You better, because what do we document? Everything. I cannot stress that enough. Any conversation of substance that you have verbal, face-to-face or on the phone, I need you to go home and follow it up with an email talking about, per our conversation, the permit states 3 bedrooms and that's all we can advertise. Document everything. Also dealing with water leaving the house or the property. There's something called straight piping. This is just waterways just directly from the machine, the device. And there's usually this big long pipe that goes out back to a creek or stream. Where we generally see this is with the washing machine, because some on-site septic systems, the washing machine can overload. So some people say, well, I'll just straight pipe it. I'll just hook my pipe up to the washing machine. So when that water drains, it goes to a nearby creek or stream. Yeah, that's not allowed. When we see that, I would advise them to look, this isn't legal. Actually, I'd advise them to fix it. But ultimately, I have a material fact on my hand. And again, all we're understanding about material facts right now is I have a duty to disclose. We always have a duty to disclose material facts. So if you come across straight piping, what are you going to do with the illegal piece of it? I don't know. Go to your broker in charge. What I do know is we have to disclose that that washing machine is straight piped into the nearby creek or stream. Questions on on-site septic systems, straight piping, etc. Another governmental control, statewide, nationwide, are areas that have been designated as flood hazards. FEMA is who determines if it's a flood hazard or not. FEMA is the Federal Emergency Management Agency. And then if an area has suffered flooding, then it has been deemed in a flood hazard. And depending on where the property is located to the hazard, flood insurance may or may not be required. The surveyor can help us determine if it's in a flood hazard. The lender will let us know if flood insurance is required. I'm here to tell you guys right now, for those of you that know, flood insurance is not cheap. This is above and beyond your homeowner's insurance. And if you're helping a buyer buy that is maxed out on their approved amount, flood insurance could tip them over the top, and now we're not getting loan approval. So flood insurance, whether or not a property is in a flood insurance, there's so many maps available that I can do a quick look. I'm not making the decisions if we need flood insurance, but I can do a quick look on these maps and say, it looks like you might be in a flood hazard. Let's investigate this further. Let's look into this. If the lender's not sure, if there's questions about the flood hazard, then they may require a survey. Surveys are generally not required, except in certain circumstances. We have a whole unit dedicated to insurance. So we're gonna see flood insurance again, along with our homeowner's insurance. That's coming in Unit 13. Not a big unit, not a tested unit, but just to be familiar with. Another government control is highway access. Back to the DOT, all the projects they have going on right now. If you want to know about a project in your area, if you want to know that there's a proposed project, one of those resources, one of those places we check out is NCDOT's website. Go to Google, start typing in North Carolina Department of Transportation. They generally break it out per county. But it's another source, it's another thing that we need to check on, because it might be that it's been approved, but they haven't shown up yet and start to do the work. If you don't see them, you don't know it's there unless we look at the website. So again, just helping our buyers gather this information, all of the information. Those of you in the triad, we have a lot going on right now. We have beltways being built, we have new streets, new construction. We have a lot going on right now. So just another thing to check when you're getting ready to list. If you're helping a buyer buy. And then the last government piece, public land use control, is just talking about wetlands. Any of you down east are dealing more with wetlands than what the rest of us are. But with wetlands, this is our marshy areas. The groundwater is at or near the surface. So the littlest bit of rain is going to cause flooding. You may not be able to build because the land can't support. We don't want that new house to sink in. But with wetlands, they are highly regulated, local, state, and federal regulations, trying to preserve our wildlife, preserve that area. And again, if the government authorities determine that this is wetlands, then you're just going to have some restrictions, or your buyer will have some restrictions. And that's our public land use controls. We went local with zoning, and then we got a little bigger. We got statewide with building codes, FEMA's, nationwide, nationwide, I should say, that kind of thing. But all in all, you guys, a public land use control is enforced by the government. May that be the local government, the state government, or the federal. So who enforces public land use controls? The government. Any violations, any restrictions will be handled through them. Questions on any of our public land use controls? The rest of this unit then is talking about private land use controls. Private land use controls is getting us into our covenants. Restrictions. Are you in an HOA? Are you in a subdivision? There's a really good chance that you have private land use control. It's enforced by the HOA. It's enforced by the homeowners. They're all set up a little bit different. When a developer is creating a new subdivision, part of their process is to create the covenants, the rules. Basically, if you want to live in this subdivision, these are the rules that you will follow. And most of them are designed to help preserve the value. It's been my experience, people either want to buy into an HOA or they don't. So that may be a question to ask a buyer very early on. Do you want an HOA? Some people have problems with them, some people don't. Understand, all covenants are different. They all have different rules. Some of them may tell you, you know, the exterior front door can only be 3 different shades of 3 different colors. Some will tell you you can't park on the street. Some will tell you you can't park the RV in the driveway. Some will tell you that the grass in your front yard can't be taller than 6 inches or something, right? They're all different. They all have different rules. And as the real estate agent helping a buyer, it's my responsibility to help provide them with these covenants. I'm a fact finder. So if somebody's going to buy in the HOA, we're going to provide them covenants so they can decide if they're good with those rules. They're recorded, so public access. Now I could probably take this class and divide you guys into 2 different categories. When I flip this slide, there are some of you that went, ew, look at that house. And then the rest of us went, ooh, look at that house. However you responded when I flipped this slide may determine whether or not you want to be in an HOA or not. If you don't want to live across the street from the bubblegum pink house, an HOA probably prohibits that. If you don't want to live next door to the guy that has all his cars on cinder blocks in the front yard, you may want to consider an HOA because there's a good chance that the HOA won't allow that. Again, it's a buyer preference thing. My job is to provide them with the information, not to offer them my opinion. I'm providing them with the facts. So the private land use controls, again, the whole idea, they're supposed to be meant to require property maintenance, keep standards, help preserve the value of the property. And they may have restrictions, like we said, parking, fencing, architectural details. There was a fantastic Geico commercial a couple years ago. Y'all remember those great Geico commercials that used to come out? And one of them was the HOA, and she was running down, chopping down hanging plants because it didn't fit in the HOA. And they were like, okay, I don't remember her name, but it was like, okay. Obviously, those weren't allowed, and somebody was enforcing them. Private land use controls are enforced by the HOA and the private owners. So if you're in an HOA with covenants and you see your neighbor is violating covenant, don't call the cops. They can't help you. You need to contact the HOA, private land use control. So these covenants are imposed by the developer. They're created by the developer when they're creating the subdivision. Once the developer is done and they have built everything and the developer leaves, the covenants remain. Covenants are appurtenant. What's that mean? Covenants run with the land. So the first owner has to follow the covenants, the second one, the 300th one. Once the developer leaves, the covenants remain. They're appurtenant. And the covenants cannot be for anything illegal. It might be that when the covenants were created, it wasn't illegal, but laws and rules have changed, and now it is, and they can't be enforced. For example, some subdivisions in the 30s and the 40s, some old subdivisions may have a covenant, may have a restriction that says certain class of people can't buy in this neighborhood. Today, that's illegal thanks to federal fair housing. It's illegal, thus it can't be enforced. So if you come across some old covenants that, for example, violate federal fair housing, then they can't be enforced. They can't be honored today. I got a whole unit for federal fair housing. So we're going to talk about the protected classes, talk about who those protected classes are. We'll spend some time with fair housing in Unit 19. What about the one in Florida that states you cannot walk your dog in the front of the property if that's a covenant? I don't see, yeah, if that's a covenant, then you can't walk your dog in the front of the property. It's there for a reason. I don't know why, but it's there for a reason. Yeah, the one about the grass in your front yard can't be any taller than, and every once in a while you get that neighbor that needs to find a hobby. They're running around from yard to yard with their yardstick to make sure that your front yard is in compliance. Let's get them a hobby. Conveyance versus covenants. If you convey, you are transferring your property from one owner to the next. You are giving your property to somebody else. Versus a covenant, which is the rules of the HOA, the rules of that subdivision. Private land use controls are enforced by the owners association, and it's all dependent on how they're set up. So maybe the individual property owners manage that subdivision and we all take turn being president, vice president, secretary, treasurer. Maybe it is managed by an owners association. So we're going to talk about, we could run into some conflict of zoning versus covenants. And before we flip the screen, look, give me just a second here. Put real estate aside just for 1 second. Pretend real estate doesn't exist. Anytime you have conflicting laws, conflicting rules, the general rule of thumb says the more restrictive of the two will prevail. So you have conflicting rules, conflicting information. Which one are we going to follow? The stricter of the two. Bring real estate in. You could have conflict between zoning and covenants. So which one do we follow? The stricter of the two. It could be that zoning was different when these covenants were created. And then we've changed zoning. And so now we have a conflict. Which one will prevail? Which one will control? The more restrictive of the two. We went through a period of time in our area where eggs got really expensive. So you know what everybody, y'all remember that? Y'all know everybody wanted? Chickens. Can I have chickens? If I can't run out of the store and buy eggs, just give me chickens. That's every single buyer that bought during that time wanted chickens. Before I can answer that question, I got to check zoning and I have to check the covenants or help them check the covenants if they're in an HOA. And it might be you can have chickens, but you can only have chicks. You can't have roosters, right? It might be that it's specific. You can only have 2. It might be very specific. Remember, I'm a fact finder. I help gather the information for them to make an informed decision. So if they really, really want chickens, we're going to help them gather to make sure zoning and covenants will allow it. So when it comes to all this, let's bring us into this. What's our broker role here? I'm going to go, let's see. Page, just make a note to look at page 127. 127 kind of talks about the broker role. Whenever you guys see VIP or something about the broker, that's something important to check out. So page 127 kind of breaks down the responsibility of the brokers. We have a duty to review our land use controls before we list the property or verify that it's accurate before we help a buyer write an offer, make an offer on a property. If your buyer has a specific end use, if it's important to them, then it's important to me. We have a duty to help them verify that their end use can be met. And when it comes to interpretation of covenants, land use control, zoning, stay in your lane. I provide the facts. I can't interpret the data. I can't interpret what this means. So if you hand them the covenants, here you go. I went online and I found your covenants. And your buyer says, well, here's this whole paragraph right here that I don't understand. What does this mean? I either need to get them to an attorney or get them to the HOA. Stay in your lane. I've provided the facts. I'm not responsible for interpreting that information, but I can help them get to the source for them to get their answers, for them to get that information. Questions? Let's take our last break. When we come back, we are going to wrap up, finish up Unit 6. I got a few more things to say about land use controls, and then we're going to jump into 20, and then we're going to talk about what Thursday looks like. So let's take 10. We are back for the last hour. How are we doing so far? So far, so good? Welcome back. So. Cameras are back on. Hey there. I am taking attendance. Those of you that were on first thing this morning, we know I'm dealing with some technical difficulties today. And for some reason, my laptop didn't work. So now I'm on like 2 devices trying to make today happen. So I appreciate y'all's patience with everything I have going on. But the good news, I walked out my laptop, my husband hit the button. I'll be danged if it just didn't fire right up. So I guess I wasn't hitting the button right or something. I don't know. But you know what matters? It's working now. So hopefully I should be back to normal on Thursday. So again, I thank you guys for your patience. So I am taking attendance. And we talked about the broker rules, the things that we see, again, page, what did we just say? 127, anything, as you guys are going through your book, as you can see, we're getting more and more into the responsibility of the broker. We had to do some groundwork. We had to do some build up to get us here. And now we're talking more and more about the broker. To finish talking about the rest of the broker's responsibility for land use controls, I have to go off book. So the next couple of slides you're not going to find in your book, but it is in the syllabus. And remember, the commission says if it's in the syllabus, then we need to discuss it. We need to make sure we have a conversation about it. So we're going to go off book for just a minute and looking in the syllabus. Other things that the syllabus tells us that the broker's role is, we have a duty to advise consumers. So whatever we find out, remember you guys, when in doubt, disclose. So if you find out that the property is subject to an owner's association, it is in an HOA with dues, or there are special assessments. Maybe it's a special assessment through the HOA. Maybe it's a special assessment through the government. We talked about those back in Unit 3. I have a duty to let my consumer know, to let my client or customer know. Remember, I'm a fact finder. If we come across any zoning ordinances or covenants that affect how they want to use the property, if it affects their end use, I have a duty to let them know. And by the way, when we advise, we're going to do it in writing. Because what do we document? Everything. So I can look at you and say, oh yeah, zoning's allowed, but I need you to is everybody good with that? So very important. So ordinances and covenants. We ideally, in a perfect world, we'd like to get this information to the buyer consumer when they're deciding if they want to present an offer. We have this information before they want to present the offer so they know what it is that they are buying into. So helping them attain it. Remember, I can't interpret zoning ordinances or covenants, but I can go over it with them. When they start asking a bunch of questions, that just got out of my hands. Interpreting legal documents is the responsibility of an attorney. When any of you guys hear anything about legality, that's the attorney's job. That's the attorney's role. Also with the broker, we have, I don't know if you guys have heard me, but just this class, I've started talking about red flags. And you're going to hear me talk more and more about red flags. And as the broker, I have the responsibility, I have the duty to be on alert for and address any red flags. I'm helping my buyer learn about this property. So when a red flag comes up, you guys, it's not like I can just ignore it and say, oh, I'm sure it'll take care of itself. If something comes up to me that doesn't seem, it seems out of the usual, it seems out of the norm, then my little red flag has gone up, and that's my indication to, we got to ask some questions. We got to look some information up. We got to get some more information to the buyer. So that buyer that has a specific end use, for example, that's when my little red flag has gone up. And you're going to start hearing me say this more and more as we get into what we need to disclose, what our responsibility is with material facts. Like I said, we're doing a deep dive on material facts when we get to Unit 7. So just being on alert, paying attention to. This is not an industry that we can hide our head in the sand and say, I didn't know that. We have a duty to find out. Y'all, again, think about the price tag on these homes that your seller is selling and your buyer's buying. They're relying on us to be the professional in this transaction. They're relying on us to assist them through the transaction. And one of the best things we can do is help them discover and disclose when these little red flags pop up. Questions or comments about that? Really the first broker role that we're getting into. And it's about how we can use our land use controls. The last little piece of this unit then, Green Star, real quick, not spending a lot of time here. Talking about land use controls, it's important to know that our government owns, they say roughly the government owns about 30% of the land in the continental United States of America. So about 30% is government owned. They can use the land for different purposes. Obviously, these are going to have controls. If these ever sell, we're not going to be involved in this. The government will have their own system, their own process. But all we need to know is that there's roughly 30% set aside, just government owned land. And that gets us through Unit 6. Key terms on page 109, there's a really good chance you were just exposed to a lot of new terms in this unit, a lot of new words. So I highly recommend you spend time with the key terms. Key point review, that checklist, Cliff's Notes, whatever you want to call it, on page 128. And then your student quiz on page 130 for our zoning. Questions, anything from Unit 6? So as mentioned, we start skipping around in the book a little bit. So now after Unit 6, we're going to fast forward just a bit. We're going to go check out Unit 20. Unit 20 in your book starts on page 521. Unit 20 is addressing environmental issues. How many of you had a chance to look at Unit 20 before class today? A few of you. Again, highly recommend we look ahead. But is it Unit 20? This is the unit that makes you terrified to breathe the air that we breathe. There's a lot of scary things out there in the environment. Unit 20 really is not meant to scare us, although it often does. Unit 20 is just meant to alert us to some of these environmental issues that we might run into. Unit 20 is almost all green stars, which means we're not spending a lot of time in it. We're not doing a deep dive on it. We're just getting the basic understanding of these environmental issues and what they mean to us, the role of the broker ultimately. So our environmental issues are our roadmap or our guide for this unit, if you will. We're going to talk about these basic environmental issues, what I need to be aware of, how I can protect my client. So first off, we need to talk about just environmental issues overall, the big picture. Environmental issues are of importance in real estate because environmental issues affect people. Excuse me. Environmental issues affect people. People buy real estate. So thus it's all combined. It all comes together. And I'll tell you right now, sneak ahead, sneak preview. When it comes to these environmental issues, my responsibility is to disclose what I know. I don't care how you learn about it. But once you learn of an environmental issue, once you learn of an environmental concern, I have a duty to disclose. I have a duty to let the consumers know when we discover. Some environmental issues may make the home harder to sell. Some buyers may have the tools and the knowledge to deal with some of these, others may not. I always say there's a buyer for every property. It's just a matter of finding the right buyer at the right price. So even with environmental issues, there's still a buyer for it. It's just a matter of what they're willing to accept, what they're willing to take in. When it comes to learning about these environmental resources, to be in the source of some information, the EPA's website is almost always the first place to start. Now, you guys don't need to get involved in the EPA's website just yet. Again, all green, mostly green stars, basic understanding of what's going on. But when you get in the real world, the EPA's website is almost always a great place to start. There are resources out there that your firm will have, etc. We will know how to deal with it if and when they come up. The other thing I kind of want to alert you guys to in Unit 20, I mentioned material facts. We're going to be talking a lot about material facts in this unit. We're not doing our deep dive of material facts until we get to Unit 7 on Thursday. So for right now, we just need to understand that a material fact is just anything that a reasonable person would be recognized as relevant when they're trying to make a decision. We're going to break that down and talk about that. All we need to know right now is if it's considered a material fact, I must disclose it. Who can remind me what it means to disclose? What does it mean to disclose? I see Mal.
Tell them.
To tell them.
Inform.
That's exactly it. I saw this a lot. So we saw the top. When you find, I'm not here to mediate it. I'm not here to correct it or make it right or remove the mold, anything like that. My job is to disclose, to tell you what I know. So we're going to get into some specifics, things that are specifically considered an environmental issue that we would have this duty to disclose. Before we do that, though, turn with me in your book to page 523. And in 523, we have a picture of our environmental hazards. I don't know of a single home that has it all. If we did come across this house, I would advise my buyer not to buy it. So this picture is not meant to show the worst case scenario. What this picture is meant to do is show us where we might come across some of these environmental issues that we're getting ready to talk about. Again, I've never seen one with all. So to me, this was like a good demolition project, right? That it's time to come down, depending on the environmental issues. But this just kind of shows us where in the home, where on the property we may find some of these scary things that we're talking about here. So the first environmental issue, the first scary thing out there in the environment is asbestos. Asbestos was once built, it was used as like an insulation or maybe a fire resistance. It was often meant to insulate pipes. So you can see this kind of white wrapping here, that's asbestos. The problem with asbestos is when it becomes friable, when it starts breaking down. If this thing were wrapped and secured, it would be fine. But the problem is this is falling down, this is breaking down. Asbestos, the little particles get in the air. We breathe the air, which means we're taking those little particles into our lungs. Asbestos has been banned from building materials. It was banned in 1978. You don't need to know that year as it relates to asbestos. All you need to know right now is that it was banned in building material. So if you're dealing with new construction, you're not going to deal with asbestos. But what if you're dealing with an older home? What if you're dealing with an old construction? I'm not telling you there's asbestos in there. I'm telling you that older homes, anything built prior to 1978, may have asbestos. And if we see it intact, it's not a problem. The problem is when it becomes friable. As far as mediating asbestos, encapsulation is preferred over removal. Because with removal, when you take it down, you're breaking it up. You're making it friable and you're making those little particles out in the air suspect to getting in our lungs. If we can encapsulate it, if you can take it and rewrap it, put it up in a place that it's not going to be friable, that's the preferred method. If demolition is coming around for a home that was built or property that was built prior to 1978, when you're pulling that permit for demolition, they're probably going to want to come in and check for asbestos and then properly remove it before you show up with the wrecking ball, before you show up to tear it down. So depending on the age of the home, I never say this right, but we've all seen the commercial on TV with the attorney. If you or someone you know has mesothelioma, that is exposure to asbestos. That means somebody worked with it. They got those little particles in their lungs. They've had exposure. Now they're dealing with respiratory issues, that kind of thing. Another environmental issue, and these are your only yellow stars in this unit, talking about lead in the home. Lead can be found in paint. Once upon a time ago, lead was used in paint because it's a drying agent. Lead helps the paint dry faster. You may also find lead from the lead pipes or solder. Solder is when you're connecting two metal pipes, two metal pieces, so some of that dust breaks through. Again, the lead particles gets in our lungs, and we breathe that air. When it comes to lead poisoning, children are the ones that are susceptible. Lead poisoning affects children. It also affects unborn fetuses, so women with children. Lead poisoning affects those little developing organs and those little developing bodies. Once you're developed, you're not as susceptible to lead poisoning. When it comes to lead in the home, you need to know that lead was banned in residential property in 1978. You need to know 1978 when it relates to lead. Lead-based Paint Hazard Reduction Act says anything built prior to 1978 may have lead in it. My job is to help educate the buyer. I'm not telling, and the tenant, by the way, because tenants come with kids too, right? So we need to help educate the tenant and the buyer. My job is not to say, this house was built in the 60s, so it has lead in it. My job is to say, because of the year it was built, it may have lead in it. So we're just trying to create awareness, trying to help educate people. Anything built prior to 1978, lead is banned. We have a form. We have a document called the Lead-Based Paint or Lead-Based Paint Hazard Addendum. And this is required on all residential and lease transactions, sales and lease, on anything built prior to 1978. And again, it doesn't say, you have lead. It says, because of the year it was built, you may have lead. And help to educate the consumer. They need to decide their risk tolerance. And they can't decide their risk tolerance if they're not educated. I'm going to go back for just a second, maybe. Oop. Previous. Go back one more. Oop. Okay. Nope. When we first started talking about lead, you see this booklet over here, Protect Your Family from Lead in Your Home. The EPA has provided this booklet to help educate the consumer. You could go to the EPA's website and find it. You don't need it for your test. In the real world, your firm should have this available to you so you can provide it to the consumer to help educate themselves on buying or living in a property with possible lead in it. Anything built prior to 1978, lead-based paint specifically says target housing. Target housing is housing that may have lead in it based on the year it was built. There's a couple exceptions. There's a couple types of housings that don't apply to lead in the home. So those exceptions. Housing for elderly people, Any housing for elderly people built prior to 1978, we don't need to worry about lead or the addendum. Remember, lead poisoning affects developing bodies. Elderly people's bodies have already been developed, so they don't have the risks, they don't have the dangers. Think of like nursing homes, retirement centers, things like that. Another exception to target housing is 0-bedroom dwellings. With 0-bedroom dwellings, think studio apartments, dorm rooms, military barracks. Those would also be exempt from target housing, things that don't require the lead-based paint hazard addendum. Yes, Kiana.
Is mold a part of the environmental?
It is, and we're going to talk about it. Yep.
Okay.
So with lead, anyone selling or leasing, the addendum says the seller or the owner of a property, they have to disclose if they know of lead. Now, as we get into unit 7 and 8, we're going to start learning that the seller, the owner, doesn't have to disclose much. They don't have to disclose what they know. This is about the only exception that I know. So when we say the seller doesn't have to disclose much, what we're saying is they don't have to disclose anything except if they know of the presence of lead in the home. I can't disclose, a homeowner can't disclose what they don't know. Fair enough? So if you don't know there's presence of lead, then you have nothing to disclose. There is a program, we're going to see this next, but there is a program that requires hired work. If you hire contract work to come in and paint, and the property was built prior to 1978, they're required to test it for lead. That falls under something called the North Carolina Lead-Based Paint Hazard Management Program. So if you're doing renovations or repairs for compensation, you're hired work. And the home was built prior to 1978, then they have a duty to send some lead in for testing. They have to send it out to a lab and have it tested. They try to chip paint from an inconspicuous place. So maybe underneath the windowsill, you know, the inside of the door frame, you know, something like that. But they actually got to chip some paint, send it into the lab. Painting over the lead paste paint doesn't make the lead go away. So no matter how many times this property, no matter how many layers of paint this property has, if it had lead in it, it will still have lead in it. And this hired help could suffer some big fines. They could be facing state fines of $750 a day. EPA could step in and give them some fines of $32,500. Where are my HGTV people? I know you guys are out there. I hope you've turned it off. But my HGTV people, you know, Chip and Joanna, remember several years ago, they got themselves in trouble for this, and it was revolving around the lead-based paint hazard management program. I don't remember the specifics, but I do remember they got themselves in trouble for that because they didn't follow. This is federal, this is national guidelines. So it doesn't matter what state you're in. Again, the seller is required to disclose what they know. If there's any reports, then they need to provide the reports. And if the seller knows, then I know. So once I know, then I have a duty to disclose as well. The best thing I can do for my buyer, I could encourage my buyer to have it tested. If they have a concern, then they can have it tested before they buy.
Miss Julie,
Yes.
I had a question. So we rent a very old home. It was in Ardmore area of Winston-Salem.
Mhm.
Super old. I know the pipes are leaking. The guy that came, we're renting right now. We had sold our house last year and we're renting now. But the pipes are all rusty down in the basement. I'm talking about they're leaking. It's pouring so much. And then the windows, half the windows here are painted shut. You can't even open them.
Right.
But that we rented from a private person. And I'm wondering, my mom was saying all this white stuff and rust is leaking from our basement all over the laundry. It's so bad. Do you think we should be concerned about that?
I think it'd be worth looking into. I'm not going to tell you good or bad because I haven't seen it, but I
Yeah,
do think it would be worth, if it's concerning to you or your
yeah,
mom, right?
yeah,
Mom knows best sometimes, right?
yeah.
So
She came over and was like, no, this is
if
not
she
okay.
didn't like it, did she? So it very well may be something to look into because you and
Okay,
your family are there, right? So
right.
you know, you want to make sure that you want to make sure you're safe.
Yep.
So
And we pay good money here, $2,000 a
Yeah,
month.
as a
So
landlord, I would say just request it from them.
if you're renting, yes, if the landlord
Yeah.
knows, they can disclose. Yeah, but the landlord may not know. They may not have
Yeah, but I
attention, but
think you could
something's
ask
up.
them to get a test done first.
Yes, yes. The buyer could test themselves, but the tenant can't because it's not your property.
Right.
So if anybody's going to test, it's coming from the landlord.
Correct. Yeah.
Yep. So what do we need to know when it comes to lead? Let's bring this back home to us. Again, there's that disclose again. Get used to seeing that. We're going to start seeing that common theme. My little red flag went up when I started studying the property and I saw that it was built prior to 1978. That's when my flag went up to tell me it's time to investigate, time to learn more. If I learn of any lead in the home, then I have that duty to disclose. And then when it comes to the addendum, that lead-based paint hazard addendum, I have a duty to make sure if I'm the listing agent, I have a duty to make sure that the owner is in compliance with the addendum. If you are a property manager and you're helping landlords and tenants, we need to make sure that the owner is in compliance. There's a for sale addendum, there's a for lease addendum, two different things, but still bottom line, the owner disclosing what they know. Let's take a pause here for a second and talk about forms. Do you guys know, has anybody broken the news to you yet? In real estate, we love our forms. We love them, man. We love our paperwork and our documents. There's an old joke down at the commission that says there's a form for that. So they have most forms scenarios for us. In this class, we're only looking at a handful of forms. We're not looking at all the forms. We're going to talk about this again in Unit 10, but we're not actually looking at the form. We are easing you into it. So when I say a handful, there's like 4 or 5 forms that we look at in this whole class. But just know when you come out of it, there's a whole lot of different forms. There's a form for that. And you will slowly be introduced to the other forms. Start small, you guys. We're just building that foundation right now. Remember, we're not giving you all of the information. So we will not look at this form, but you guys will see it when you get out in the real world. You'll see it in post licensing. We look at it there. Questions on lead-based paint or just lead in general? Another scary environmental issue we may come across is radon. Radon is the result of decaying matters in the ground. And as those items, as those matters decay, they release a gas. When that gas is released, it's looking for cracks in the ground to get out. It's looking for escapes for those cracks, for that gas to get out. And if there happens to be a crack under your home, the radon gas is releasing into your home. So one thing we should definitely encourage buyers to do as part of their buying process is to have a radon test. A radon test is a contraction. You set it up in your property and it takes like a snapshot of the radon level every hour for like 2 or 3 days. So 12 o'clock, 1 o'clock, 2 o'clock, etc. for 2 or 3 days. At the end of that time, then we get an average. And if the average level of radon in the property is more than 4.0 picocuries, we have an issue. The issue can be resolved by a mitigation system. With radon, the key is ventilation. If you have a tightly sealed property and we don't have anywhere for that air to go, if you have a vacant property where doors and windows aren't being opened and closed on the regular as people are coming and going, then you may have a higher level of radon. And anything above 4.0 picocuries, the EPA says that we need a mitigation system. This, you guys see this white pipe on the side of the house here? This is our radon mitigation system. And down here, it's drilled into the property, and it goes into the crawl space. And throughout this pipe are little fans that pull the air out of the crawl space, including the radon, pull it out, and send it out into the atmosphere where it belongs anywhere. We're preventing it from escaping into the property. Even if a property has this mitigation system, you can walk to the side of the house and see this thing. You can see that it's there. There's often a contraction, a dial device on the inside as well that indicates the radon level. Even if you see these mitigation systems, we should still encourage our buyer to have a radon test to see if it's something that we need to address. Because here's the deal. Those little fans in the pipe here that pull the air out, they don't last forever. They may only last 5 or 10 years. You can't smell radon. You can't see radon. So the only way you know there's going to be a level of radon is if you have it tested. Y'all, I showed a property several years ago in Winston-Salem, and they had a mitigation system in the property. I mean, my buyers and I stood there and talked about it. We stood in the basement and looked at the contraction. We pointed at it. We had a conversation about it. My buyers decided to go under contract, put this property under contract. I encouraged them to have a radon test. And at the end, even with the mitigation system, it came back, I don't remember, it's like 6 point something, 7 point something, which is high, but not insane. Insane is like 12 or 14, right? Super high. But even 6 point something, the EPA says, whoa, 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 we need to address this. So I called the listing agent called the seller called their radon mitigation guy, who came out, and guess what? It was because these little fans here had stopped working. So even if you have a radon mitigation system in your home, you may still want to have it tested periodically. He fixed the fans. We set up a new radon test, and it came back at like 2 point something now, so we were good. Had we not had it tested, we would never know that. So again, even if you live in a home or you're in a home right now that has a radon mitigation system, still consider having it tested every once in a while. There are home tests that you can get now from like Lowe's or Home Depot. And the radon guy says those home tests aren't bad. So as long as you're following the instructions and set it up right, if your home test has a high radon level, we need to get the radon guy in here and take care of it. That's kind of a side note for you. Radon is everywhere. This was from a CE class. The year was on here. This is a 2017 map, so it might be out of date a little bit, but it's still going to be about the same. And you can see the western side of our state tends to have higher levels of radon than the eastern side. Think about the difference in the ground. You go down to the coast and it's sandy, it's more absorbent. You go up to the mountains and it's rocky. It doesn't have anywhere to go, nowhere to absorb. I mean, check out, we're like what? We're right here-ish. I don't know why, but Forsyth County is known for having high levels of radon. So just think, oh, we're not in the mountains, we don't have to worry about it. The other thing you need to be aware, the guy next door may test at 1 point something. That means absolutely nothing for your radon level. Because remember, it's just wherever matters are decaying, and things decay all sorts of underground. So radon's everywhere. The only way to know for sure is to have it tested. And our buyers, no matter what, should always be encouraged. I can't make anybody do anything, but I can encourage a radon test. I can talk about the importance of having one done. So when it comes to radon, our role, our responsibility, I have a duty to disclose any known presence of radon of 4.0 picocuries or higher. Just because we see a radon mitigation system, I'm not screaming material fact. If I see a radon mitigation system, my little red flag has gone up to encourage me to find out more. That radon mitigation system, maybe it was built, some people are building homes today with the system in place. Others are having them installed because they have an issue. It's not a material fact, but my little red flag did just go up to encourage me to find out more, ask questions. I need to dig a little deeper. Let's imagine we're going to learn as we get further and further. Bear with me a second here. But one thing we're going to learn, the buyer has an opportunity of time when they first contract to decide if they want to carry through and purchase the property or if they want to walk away. They're going to have their inspections and their investigations done, and they have a choice. They either buy or they don't once they've learned about the property. So let's say, for example, you're a buyer's agent. You help your buyer get under contract. Congratulations. They have the radon test, and it comes back more than 4.0 picky carries. They may ask the seller, will you put in a radon mitigation system? The seller is under no obligation whatsoever to do that. So let's say the seller says, no, I'm not going to do any repairs and I'm not going to put on a radon mitigation system. The buyer now has a choice to make, right? They either buy the property at 6.0 picky carries and deal with it, or they take advantage of that opportunity and they choose to walk away. More on that in Unit 10, I promise. Let's pretend the buyer walks away and you tell the listing agent, radon level came back high, seller won't address it, so my buyers are terminating. Property goes back on the market. Listing agents, do you now have a material fact? Do you now know for sure that that radon level was more than 4.0? So guess what? When you go back on the market, you have to disclose that high radon level. Again, all properties have a buyer. I'm a very firm believer in that. It's just a matter of finding the right one. But now that we know there's an issue with radon, and it might be worth having a conversation with the seller, being like, look, we have a buyer in our hand. And if they walk away, the radon is not going to go anywhere. So you know what the next buyer is going to find, and the buyer after that, the buyer after that. So the seller may choose to take care of it. They may not my decision to make. I'm providing them their choices. I'm letting them know their options. What we need to know, once you know of that high radon level, it becomes a material fact that we have to disclose. Again, more on that in Unit 10, the whole process, that right to walk away. Good things, fun things for us to look forward to. Questions on radon? Another environmental concern addressed in the syllabus. We're not covering the book. Remember, we're covering the syllabus. So another environmental concern is groundwater contamination. Groundwater, once it's filtered through, it eventually becomes our drinking water. So when that groundwater gets contaminated, it's an environmental concern. Things that can contaminate groundwater, runoff from landfills, leaking underground storage tanks. We're going to talk about underground storage tanks. Decaying matters, again, can affect our drinking water. Different chemicals that we use on our lawn for pest control, weed control, all of that can affect our groundwater. Again, just a duty. If I know of contaminated groundwater, I have a duty to disclose that. And by the way, this is like big news. My High Point, Jamestown people, this probably happened, I don't know, 8-10 years ago. We had an E. coli scare. If you were around, you remember. I now have backup drinking water because I didn't then, so I do now. Life lesson learned, yes? Another environmental issue, here's our underground storage tanks. Underground storage tanks, the old tanks, especially the abandoned tanks. Usually they're steel, and over time, those steel tanks corrode. And as they corrode, anything in them, such as oils, gases, various things that we may need to heat our property, for example, those gases and oils, those things in the underground storage tank will start leaking. And as we just said, when they leak, they get into our groundwater, and now we got an environmental issue. If it's discovered that there's oil in the ground, they're going to source it back. They're going to figure out where it came from. And if they source it back to an underground storage tank in your yard, you're responsible for cleanup. Even if you didn't have anything to do with it, maybe you didn't even know it was there, but it is in your yard, your property. So one thing we can do, if it's an active tank, and it might be above ground, it might be sometimes you see them on like the side of the house, but it might be below ground. And if it's still an active tank, you're going to see like a pipe sticking out from the ground. If you're walking in the backyard with your sellers or buyers and you trip over a pipe, your little red flag just went up because it's got to be attached to something. And addressing this gets very expensive and it gets very complicated. There's funding out there available to assist with cleanup. Y'all, it's estimated that there are millions of abandoned underground storage tanks across the country because we weren't always as knowledgeable as what we are today. And once upon a time ago, how we addressed abandoned tanks was just to bury them out of sight, out of mind, right? Well, now there's problems. Now there's issues. Again, those contaminants are leaking. And when they source it back to your property, the owner, the current owner, is going to be responsible for the cleanup, hopefully available to use those funds. So there's federal and state laws that address how it's handled. Do we remove the tank? Do we clean it up? Let the professionals handle that. It's more involved than a funnel and kitty litter, though. A lot more involved. So let the professionals come in and handle that. Just as a side note, the act to clean it up, there's several state acts. We're going to see those in just a second when we get to page 534. But the act that can help with cleanup, the costs, that kind of thing. So if you come across it, this is a great place to start. For us, when it comes to underground storage tanks, if we know of an underground storage tank, we have to disclose. So again, you trip over that pipe or the owner says, yeah, we got an abandoned one. Guys, I'm not responsible. It's not like I'm going to be out there with my metal detector looking for it. But once I learn of one, and I don't care how you learn about it. Once you learn of one, you know, and we have a duty to disclose that it is there. Buyer's agents, if we do come across a tank, we should encourage our buyer to learn more about it. Have the soil tested. Y'all make a note after class, don't do it now, but make a note in your books on page 529. There's an absolutely fascinating story of what can happen when these things go undetected. Don't do it now. Look at all y'all reading. Don't do it now. That's a distraction. This is why we look ahead, right? But just make yourself a note to look at it after class. Let's see what agency helps with the cleanup since it's expensive. I don't know their name, but it's going to be with the where is it? With the act, whatever act we just saw. My back button's not working. But on page 539, excuse me. Yeah, 534. It's the North Carolina Leaky Petroleum Underground Storage Tank Cleanup Act. 534. So that's going to be your place to start. My slide skipped on me. So another environmental concern is talking about our landfills. Landfills, they were either once the source of a mining project, so think of like an old quarry or something, or it was dug specifically for landfills. Landfills are highly recommended. They're usually lined to control drainage, like garbage juice. We want to make sure that that's controlled, where that goes, how that's regulated. One thing we should encourage our buyers to do, I mean, all of us, when your buyer is under contract and they're learning about the property, we're going to help them learn all about the property. And one thing they should be encouraged to do is to go to Google Maps and put the address in and then just start zooming out. How far away is the landfill? How far away are some of these various sites? Is there a water treatment plant nearby? Having them learn about the area. Tell them to hop in the car and drive around and see what you see. Again, it comes down to a preference. Some people don't mind living near a landfill. Other people, once they find out, they may not be interested in the property. Landfills, for the most part, aren't that big of an issue. But I'll tell you what, if you live near a landfill and you walk out on your front porch on a hot August day, it's not going to smell good. Another environmental issue, this one is not in your book, but another environmental issue is referring to our brownfields. This is land that was contaminated because it used to be an industrial use. It used to be a commercial use. So it's an old warehouse or factory. Usually it's been abandoned. And those chemicals are just out polluting the land. One of my teammates actually just came across a brownfield. They were helping their buyers buy a condo awfully close to Old Salem. Not quite downtown, but within walking distance. But once upon a time, though, it used to be a plant, an industrial plant. And so now that area has been deemed a brownfield. And again, it's just a matter of helping them gather the information, helping them determine their comfort level. Never look at a buyer and say, oh, you don't have to worry about a brownfield. Remember, if it's important to them, then it's important to me. And then the last environment, well, the last one we're going to talk about today is our mold. Somebody asked about mold. Boy, mold is fascinating, you guys. Mold ranges from that loaf of bread you've had too long, the whole way up to black toxic mold and everything in between. Not all mold is bad mold. Mold is everywhere. I mean, take a big, deep breath. You probably just inhale some kind of mold spore, mold particle, especially as wet and damp as it is outside right now. So just because we have mold isn't reason to get excited. However, excessive mold can cause respiratory issues, sinus problems, etc. The picture we're looking at here, this would be excessive mold because we can see it. You probably, if we had a scratch and sniff feature, we'd probably be able to smell it too. If something smells mildewy or moldy, there's some kind of bacteria living there. I'm not an expert. I can't tell you what it is. Especially, somebody said you were in Ardmore. Ardmore basements are historic. They are known for smelling basementy. There is no smell that is basementy. What you're smelling is some kind of mold or mildew, and it's all those excessive, all that moisture. So mold can grow on any organic substance. It just needs a little bit of moisture and oxygen. Mold does not take long to grow. In the right environment, mold can go big and it can go fast. So we're on the lookout for little red flags. Do you smell something basementy? Was there a previous leak? Maybe the roof leaked or the upstairs bathroom leak. That water, when it leaked, we may have addressed the leak, but it may have left behind some mold or mildew. Again, this isn't something that we can treat. It's not like we can show up with a bottle of bleach and say, I got this. Let's let the experts handle it. Mold's also important because many insurance companies no longer address mold in their policies. So this, for the most part, you may be able to find an insurance company that does, but for the most part, mold is going to be an out-of-pocket expense. So the sooner we can get to it, the better. So don't ignore that smell. Don't ignore that. Go ahead and get the experts in to address it so we can take care of it. When it comes to mold, our role, our responsibility. The Real Estate Commission says, look, don't get excited about mold unless it's an excessive amount. They consider an excessive amount anything more than 1 square foot. Anything more than that. And we're looking for little red flags about mold. We're looking for, again, signs of leaks, previous leaks, maybe the roof leaked, maybe the upstairs bathroom leaked, maybe it's a basement that leaks when it rains. Water belongs on the outside. Water on or in a home is generally not good. It causes all sorts of issues. So just being on the lookout, looking for those little red flags. And if there is a concern, then it's something that the buyer can address when they're researching the property, when they're looking into it. Of course, if we do have excessive amount, then it's a material fact listing agents, which means we have a duty to disclose that. We have a duty to disclose what we know. So again, and there's more environmental issues in your book than what you need to know. So just stick to what the syllabus says, just stick to what we have here. Again, we're not doing a deep dive on these things. Even in the real world, we're still going to refer to the experts. We're still going to let the experts. We're just needing to know what to look out for. Needing to know those little red flags. And if your little red flag goes up, it's telling you we need to inspect, we need to investigate, we need to learn more. Questions? So this is where we are today. Thursday, I have about, I don't know, not even 5 more minutes before we wrap up Unit 20. So we just got a few more things to say in Unit 20 and we'll wrap that up. And then we are jumping into Unit 7 on Thursday. What did we say about Unit 7? I love the animation coming out. Yes. Unit 7 is a highly tested unit. So Thursday starts the big stuff, you guys. Thursday is when things are going to start getting real. The information from units 1 through 6 and 20, you're going to be tested on, but they're not heavily tested. We just had to build you up so we could have these conversations as we get further and further, as we start getting into agency on Thursday. I think units 7, 8, 9, and 10, when you guys signed up for this class, I think those are the 4 units that you envisioned that we were doing. So this is it. This is us now, starting on Thursday. Please, please look ahead. Please. It'll make Unit 7 a lot easier. Oh, we'll Kahoot on Thursday too. So you can expect units 4, 5, and 6 will Kahoot. Just kind of recap and see how we're doing. And then we're jumping into 7, getting into the good stuff. What do we think about that? Is that exciting? Finally, we're here. Yay. Please look ahead. What questions or comments do I have? If none, that's what I got. You guys have a great afternoon. Stay dry. I think we got some more rain coming. So have a great afternoon. Have a good day tomorrow. And we'll see you guys Thursday morning. Thank you.